Prequel when you get drafted s ohm of the interview material collated herein was originally commissioned as the basis for the projected sleeve notes to the 25th anniversary reissue of Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables. The fact that said endeavor was derailed by wrangling among former members will come as no great surprise to long-standing observers of dead Kennedys. The maxim is that history is dictated by the winners, whether said victory be defined by court case, fiscal arm-twisting, media access, or variations on those themes. Efforts to maintain authorial independence on the project were undermined by warring factions competing over the narrative, and in the end, the sleeve notes were withdrawn, or rather just tossed aside. The final stumbling block was a single sentence, which is retained in this book. You'll struggle to spot it, though. It's astonishingly innocuous. It got very messy, and at times deeply unpleasant, but it represents subject matter I was always committed to returning to, and it's taken to the 30th anniversary and beyond to sort it all out. It was a salutary lesson in how deep some feuds run, and yet I maintain that it was a tragic denouement to a job well worth undertaking. Informed readers will doubtless be aware how much the reputation of the band has been tarnished over recent years. To borrow San Francisco Chronicle writer James Sullivan's analogy, any metaphysical statue the city might have erected in the band's honor just got covered in seagull poop. Yet a great band they truly were. I am not alone in ranking Fresh Fruit as one of the most important albums to emerge from punk, one of only a handful that genuinely transcended genre, stretching musical and lyrical conventions while making a point, or several dozen, and jabbing funny bones the world over. This is an effort to restore its standing, or hose off some of the guano. In fact, the history of this project extends even deeper than the sleeve note debacle. In 1991, I was editing a British music magazine to which someone submitted an article on the band. I was very keen to publish, and sent it off to Dead Kennedy's singer Jello Biafra for evaluation and scrutiny. When he eventually replied there were over 100 written amendments, he wasn't too taken by the writer. He wasn't all that impressed, either, when he discovered said magazine's publisher had bootlegged DK's records, in the past a fact I was blissfully unaware of at the time. In the event, the magazine disappeared down the tubes. In effect, then, what you are reading has spent 2 decades in gestation. That sounds overly grand. I've applied myself to the odd job in between. Our correspondence continued, albeit sporadically, over the course of 2 decades. Thereafter, I was commissioned to submit an article on the band for another music magazine, and a similar process of writing and revision was embarked upon. Unfortunately, at that precise moment, the legal shenanigans between the former bandmates erupted, and the piece was lost in the shuffle. Another few years rolled by, and in 2005, I was asked to write the aforementioned sleeve notes. I was thrilled, naively thinking I could get around entrenched positions by playing fair and being transparent to all parties. I spent about a month working with the former members on new interviews and got some great material. Then it got to the nitty-gritty, and pretty soon I was trying to mediate various issues, showing each party the other's replies and attempting to reconcile what could broadly and generously be described as competing takes on history. The opposing parties by this point had diluted to Biafra versus guitarist East Bay Ray, which again will not be a surprising revelation to those who know something of the band's internal politics. Klaus Flower-Eyed Bass very much follows Ray's lead in interband affairs, and Ted, in charmingly typical drummer-like fashion, seemed completely bemused as to why anyone would wish to bother. I was pretty close to coming round to his way of thinking by the end. Patty just doesn't cover it. The 10 drafts wound up running to over 64,000 words. We had space for 5,000. At one stage, an employee at Alternative Tentacles, Dead Kennedy's record label, subsequently administered by Biafra, complained that I'd single-handedly broken their printer. There was a lengthy telephone debate on whether to allow a band member the use of the personal rather than collective pronoun. As part of my increasingly desperate attempts at appeasement, I ended up totting up quote allocations to prove that everyone's thoughts were evenly accounted for. If the men in white coats had knocked at my door at this stage, I would have gone quietly. The absolute nadir was when one band member, not Biafra, accused me of being the cause of his bad back. Over a transatlantic phone call. Repeatedly. In the end, it ran something like this. Biafra will chide and cajole, and do his utmost to persuade you of the veracity of his interpretation of events. Then he will concede that you have the right to call it, as you see it, as a writer. Ray will chide and cajole, and do his utmost to persuade you of the veracity of his interpretation of events. And then he will call his lawyer. The curse of the Kennedys. I must admit I am finalizing the current manuscript with more than vague apprehension. What else could possibly go wrong? For all that, I still adore the record. Fresh fruit for rotting vegetables is not London Calling. It is not Never Mind the Bollocks, nor is it the Ramones. To me, it is superior to that lauded trio, mainly because of the lyrical and musical intelligence that underpins it, which utterly captivated and compelled back in 1980, scarcely 3 decades ago. I could support this doubtless hysterical contention by pointing out that it regularly features in greatest punk album polls voted for by the people, though it should be noted that the people are a stupid bunch, by and large, as Sid Vicious once set out in rather more florid terms. The album's afterlife is such an extraordinary achievement for a band who had practically zero radio play and only released records on independent labels, no Emmy, CBS, or Warner's for them. They not only existed outside of the mainstream, but were, as V. Veil of Search and Destroy fanzine noted, the first band of their stature to turn on and attack the music industry itself. The DKs set so much in motion. They were integral to the formulation of an alternative American network that allowed bands on the first rung of the ladder to tour outside of their own backyard. They were instrumental in supporting the concept of all-ages shows and spurned the advances of corporate rock promoters and industry lapdogs. They legitimized the whole notion of an American punk band working successfully in the UK and Europe while disseminating the true horror of their native country's foreign policies, effectively serving as anti-ambassadors on their travels. The record label they established, the still thriving Alternative Tentacles, boasts as challenging a back catalog of musical extremity to service dysfunctional listening tastes as you could possibly desire. And the gallery of crooked politicians, charlatan preachers, and corporate crocodiles they managed to provoke over the course of their career is unparalleled. How much are they part of the DNA of both punk and popular music? Although it's not scientific, Jack Black's School of Rock Blackboard traces a straight line that runs Pistols, Ramones, Clash, Dead Kennedys. Biafra will have a right wobbly when I use that as justification. I'm a bit wobbly myself. The aforementioned triumvirate Pistols, Clash, Ramones has collectively had more than 100 books published in their name. The DKs have never been written about at length, or celebrated accordingly, despite Fresh Fruit selling over 250,000 records in Europe alone. Their own fault, really. They never progressed to make a rock and roll record conventional rock criticism, continuing to hold that the punk genus is something intrinsically juvenile, at the very best a chrysalis stage. They also fell out spectacularly, meaning people tend to tread warily around demonstrably litigious elements in this story. And in many ways, what they put on the record was more intractably violent towards public and critical perception. Sure, I wanted the band to last, says Biafra. But some of the best bands are the ones that go out of their way to shock and annoy people, and not just pander and please. Here's a story that gives credence to that statement. Fresh Fruit arrived at a juncture when critics and opinion leaders had distanced themselves from punk, claiming primacy in its discovery, but disdain of its subsequent trajectory. The school of thinking that suggests art is ruined at the moment it is consumed by more than a small cultural elite. The UK had 3 specialist music papers, demanding a steady stream of flavors of the week. By the turn of the decade, New Romanticism was the latest bag for the style-conscious heavy metal was being readmitted to polite society for those bereft of such concerns, and punk was widely regarded as a victim of infant mortality. But an evolution was underway and a corrective overdue. For many who believed that the movement was more than a showy outcrop of the unhindered continuum of rock and roll, Fresh Fruit confirmed punk's potential to stand for something beyond the trappings of fashion and faux rebellion. The debate over punk etymology, whether it originated in CBGB or St. Martin's College of Art, is effectively asinine, but it's unarguable that by the late 70s the UK had shaped the discourse. By the turn of the 80s, however, Brit punk was beginning to run on empty. Subject matter and stylistic form were contracting. Crass had politicized punk in a sharp rebuttal of the Clash, who had moved on to Starry Lights and Stadiums and the imploding Pistols. As Biafra himself notes, Crass were trying to get punks to think and act beyond punk, that feeling good about buying an album called Sandinista did nothing to actually help anyone in Nicaragua. But for all their intelligence and sincerity, Crass were too abrasive, too austere to make a record of similar weight. Punk, at least in the UK, had become woefully po-faced and worthy, simply too obvious. As Al Spicer would write, when their debut record California Uber Alles was first spun by John Peel, it sounded like nothing the British punk scene had heard before, and was as refreshing and welcome as the bugle sound of the cavalry coming to the rescue. Fresh Fruit offered a perfect hybrid of humor and polemic strapped to a musical chassis that was as tetchy and inventive as Biafra's withering broadsides. Those lyrics, cruel in their precision, were revelatory. But it wouldn't have worked if the underlying sonics were not such an uproarious rush, the paraffin to Biafra's naked flame. And if we can set aside the Bickerfist for a fleeting moment, we can remember what a cool, funny, savage little record Fresh Fruit for rotting vegetables was. At the Mabuhay, 1978, Audience After Crime set Biafra, Bruce Connor, and Mindogis Bagdan in the front row. Photographed by Ruby Ray, Avengers, live at the Mabuhay 1977. Penelope Houston, Greg and Graham, and Danny Furious. Photographed by Ruby Ray. Chapter 1. So you've been to school for a year or two. It is an odd thing, but everyone who disappears is said to be seen at San Francisco. It must be a delightful city and possess all the attractions of the next world. Oscar Wilde, it's the American in me that makes me watch the blood running out of the bullet hole in his head. The Avengers, the American in me, referencing JFK's assassination. San Francisco was a natural crucible for punk. For years it had been synonymous with liberal thought, with vocal gay rights, feminist and ecological lobbies, and in the 60s became a magnet to the Beats and Bass Camp for the Summer of Love. It also had the working-class districts one would associate with a port town. A haven then for weirdos, hippies, and eccentrics, as well as more rational left-leaning thinkers. It was natural that, after New York, and alongside its Californian neighbor Los Angeles, it rejoiced in the punk ethos of difference. It was, after all, at the city's Winterland Ballroom that the Sex Pistols played their final show, not so much passing the baton as dropping it where they stood, or in Sid's case, fell over. In San Francisco, notes singer Jello Biafra, a lot of the prime movers of all the different things in the arts over the years came from people who came there from somewhere else. It's not like London or New York, where a lot of the people grew up there. It's a city where people are drawn from all over the country, and even the world, to chase their dream and find some freedom to try to see what they can become. A city that Paul Kantner of Jefferson Airplane once succinctly described as 49 square miles surrounded by reality. Any reference to the latter band in a book about dead Kennedys might provoke bewilderment, but the lineage back to the 60s was clear. The band itself was explicit. We were trying to restore what the hippies believed in. Guitarist East Bay Ray would state, tolerance for experimentation, the do-it-yourself thing and the questioning of authority. And adds Biafra, insurrection, direct action, and good old-fashioned pranks. If the city offered opportunity for innumerable square pegs, Frisco's traditional celebration of outsiders was also readily simpatico with punk values, the discarding of status built on appearance, wealth, or career advancement. Unlike London, Biafra points out, San Francisco had no Carnaby Street or Kings Road. Punk fashion throughout California was 98% DIY, straight out of charity shops. Look at old pictures of the Weirdos and the Dickies. Even the Hollywood punks got their gear from Salvation Army. Instead, San Franciscan punk made personal eccentricities a positive and baited the pomposity of those who would assume authority over others. Above all, it fetishized individuality, personal creativity, and self-expression. Mutual support and collaboration were key elements. One of punk's myths was that its year zero culture was effectively a big bang and instant grow bag with everyone at each other's throats, when in truth it scooped up those already disaffected and desperately waiting for something to happen, something the misfits and misshapes could belong to. When Ray put up an advert, guitarist wants to start punk or new wave band, in Aquarius Records, reprinted in San Francisco's BAM newspaper, he had a singular intention. He wanted to have the best such band in San Francisco, which may not sound such a lofty ambition, but by the time the ad was placed in 1978, the city had already midwifed a hugely diverse punk generation. Frontrunners Crime and the Nuns delivered attitudinal, primal rock and roll, and to this day dispute the honor of being the city's first punk band. Crime, who initially eschewed the punk tag, would take the stage dressed as cops, or in fedoras or tuxedos, play turbocharged Stooges-like punk blues at deafening volume, with a sense of melodrama that recalled Kiss as much as MC5. They legendarily told Seymour Stein that he needed to get the Ramones a haircut. The Nuns, led by Jennifer Miro, and featuring future alt-country star Alejandro Escovedo, were no less a force, the visual equivalent of Marlene Dietrich fronting the Dead Boys, and for some time, the movement's biggest live draw. They were the first San Francisco punk band to play an official gig at the scene epicenter Mabuhay Gardens, and the first to be courted by the majors, though in the end they elected to sign with Howie Klein's 415 when a deal with Columbia fell through. It was a harbinger of the fate that would befall all of the city's pioneering punk bands. The Avengers, who alongside the Nuns supported the Pistols at Winterland, had a keen instinct for taut melody as well as aggression. With singer Penelope Houston as impossibly cool, photogenic lead, they led the second wave, but cruelly never got to release an album despite having material sufficient for 3. Their peers included the highly theatrical Populous Mutants, who played alongside the Cramps at the State Mental Asylum in Napa, causing consternation among guards attempting to differentiate between performer and audience. The Dills, led by the Kinman brothers, had relocated from San Diego and established a class-themed political consciousness that would later be refined in the region's punk Bible/pre-internet punk networking compass Maximum Rock and Roll. The Swaggering Sleepers from Palo Alto, featuring Crime's original drummer Ricky Williams on vocals, a registered schizophrenic Trailer Park Live Wire, referenced the Stooges, but also mined SF's psychedelic, musical, and pharmaceutical hinterland, and were the Germs Darby Crash's favorite band. The insanely confrontational negative trend probably held the upper hand, however, in terms of envelope pushing. In one of his last acts as manager of the Real Sex Pistols, Malcolm McLaren had asked them to headline above his charges at Winterland after inquiring as to the identity of the worst band in the area. Original vocalist Roz Rezabek left at the age of 17, the Bay Area's very own Iggy having burnt himself out physically. He had famously completed a show with a broken arm at the Iguana Studios before an indifferent Sandy Pearlman, renowned for producing Blue Oyster Cult, but having just worked on the Clash's second album, Give Him Enough Rope. Indeed, he had not merely broken his arm, but actually gone to hospital, then returned to the gig to break it again in a different place. Biafra unsuccessfully auditioned for the vacant spot. So too did Bruce Luce, who would eventually find a berth in fellow Negative Trend survivor Will Shatter's subsequent band, Flipper. Dead Kennedys would arrive as part of a third wave spearheaded by the Offs, who blended buzzsaw guitar and Velvet Underground-style drone noise with dub bass. Incidentally, this author does not claim to have been a witness to any of these bands. Fortuitously, Joe Reese at Target Video shot them all, providing the most comprehensive audio and visual catalog of an emerging movement that any Johnny Latecomer could wish to access. The shock of hearing Dead Kennedys, therefore, at least outside San Francisco, has to be reconciled to this unique context. What made California Uber Alles and Holiday in Cambodia sound more jarring, sarcastic, and musically spiteful than the offspring of Lidon and Strummer was the result of a scene largely sealed from outside gaze, in which the impetus to outdo, outperform, and out was abroad. Not only had the city embraced punk, it had accelerated the process of personalizing it. All those storied groups, however, were forced to survive without any kind of infrastructure at a time when recording and independently releasing records remained a pipe dream. It was against this firmament of fast-evolving creative dissidents and logistical obstacles that any new San Franciscan punk band would have to measure itself. Already a seasoned musician who had grown up on his dad's Duke Ellington collection, Ray, the band's sole Bay Area native, was inspired by Scotty Moore's guitar playing on Elvis's early records, as well as Syd Barrett's Pink Floyd. It was seeing the latter band play at Winterland in October 1970 as a 12-year-old that convinced him to pick up a guitar. Later, he got into the Ohio Players when 70s rock started to chase its own tail. He was immediately excited by the arrival of the Ramones and the first English punk records he heard. Ray had a caveat in reference to potential respondents to his advert. In defiance of prevailing notions, he wanted everyone to be not just proficient or capable, but individually excellent. Raymond Pepperell, to use Ray's birth name, has a mathematics degree. I graduated from University of California, Berkeley, so I have a right brain and a left brain. I forget which is which. I really respond to music, though non-intellectually. His parents were both politically active. They were involved in the civil rights movement, fighting blockbusting in the 50s and 60s. People would put a black family in a block of white people, then buy up all the white houses cheap. And redlining insurance, neighborhoods, the practice of hiking insurance costs in predominantly black areas. My parents were fighting that too. My parents were definitely activists and liberals, particularly in civil rights. I know I got dragged to 1 or 2 protest meetings. My dad was even on the school board for a while. He worked at a corporation and wore a suit and tie, but was doing this stuff. Both mom and dad dressed straight-laced. But they weren't. My mom used to listen to Pete Seeger in the Weavers and Frank Sinatra. Guilty pleasure, he was already an experienced, if unfulfilled musician. I only had 6 months of guitar lessons, and the teacher wasn't showing me what I wanted to know, so I mostly learned from records. In high school, I played with friends, and my brother played drums. That was in the suburbs of California, Castro Valley, still in the East Bay. I went to college and stopped playing. When I got out of college, I was playing in a bar band at the time, making $100 a week. I thought I can live off this, so I was working 3 or 4 nights a week. It wasn't satisfying, but it was educational. The one document of this time is his contribution to the Bay Area showband Cruisin', who cut one single, Vicky's Hickey, which the band sold at shows through the mid-70s. They even had alternate Beatles and Beach Boys sets, complete with swimming trunks. By the time 1978 swung around, he had begun to notice punk stirring. I'd heard of the Sex Pistols and Ramones, and I was listening to them. Then I went to see the Weirdos at the Mabuhay Gardens. One of the ways I like to test music is if the little hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. That happened when I saw the Weirdos live. This is what I want to do. I was in the area having dinner and I wandered in and talked to them. Thereafter he put his plan in motion, but was determined that his new band's musicianship should be spurred rather than tethered by the punk breakout. Instinctively, he rejected the 2 chords and the truth mantra of UK punk. Originally, when I put up the advertisements for the band, one of the images of punk was that you shouldn't be able to play your instrument, which is a bit of a myth. When I put the ad in, I said I wanted to start a punk band, but people had to be able to play. The first respondent to the Aquarius advert was Eric Boucher, soon to be known to the world as Jello Biafra, a nom de plume chosen at random from a notebook after originally billing himself as occupant. 3. When I put the ads up, I was dealing with different people. Ray continues. Talking on the phone, then meeting with them and playing with them. I was working with someone else in Biafra at the same time, writing songs together. The other guy showed up an hour late. And that was it. I said, I've been waiting here an hour. Thank you very much. They were both talented. But everyone in DK's had that craftsman work ethic about showing up on time. This won't get anywhere otherwise. It's about commitment. Biafra had grown up in Boulder, Colorado, the son of a librarian mother and a psychiatric social worker father who also wrote poetry. Both endorsed Martin Luther King's advocacy of passive resistance. Authority figures, notably a 6th-grade teacher who would daily profess what a good man Richard Nixon was, collided against an embryonic political consciousness forged by the anti-war demonstrations Eric could observe taking place at Colorado University from his elementary school window. As a consequence, he immersed himself in the prevalent hippie culture, with its attendant stand against the Vietnam War and advocacy of environmentalism, civil rights, and free love, but he later became horrified by its slide into exploitative practices and self-satisfaction. Realizing how manipulative this community had become was fundamental to his worldview, seeing many hippies turn their backs on their ideals and evolve into what is now called New Age and yuppies. He sought refuge instead in pranks and music. A shit stirrer was born, or rather, as Biafra prefers to have it, referencing Abby Hoffman, sacred cows make the tastiest hamburgers. The proud tradition of American shit-stirringdom had a new inductee. While his family preferred classical music, the first records he possessed were by Creedence Clearwater Revival and Steppenwolf, Christmas gifts both, followed by a couple of Led Zeppelin albums and the Woodstock soundtrack. Blue Oyster Cult are significant, he adds, because their Tyranny and Mutation was the first one I ever bought without first hearing the songs on the radio. I was fed up with radio by age 13, in 1971, so I started buying records whose covers looked cool, especially since that first one really hit the spot. My big later interests also included the Stooges, Pink Fairies, 13th Floor Elevators, Hawkwind, Frank Zappa, Black Sabbath, and, believe it or not, Sparks, because their lyrics and songs were so demented, especially the Indiscreet album. Many of these initial purchases were through local store Trade-A-Tape, nearby his high school. Faithfully dedicated to servicing country rock to local residents, the proprietors would throw anything they regarded as slightly weird into a free box outside the store. Later, he was fortunate enough to discover the original Wax Trax store in Denver, run by Jim Nash and Danny Flesher, who later moved the shop to Chicago and set up the famed record label of the same name. All of a sudden, I noticed this window and it had Old Yardbirds records in it, and a John Denver record nailed onto the door, nails through his eyes and blood pouring out, and I figured, aha, this is the place for me. MC5 were also an important addition to his growing musical consciousness. What got me clued into them was the music critic of the Denver Post. His name was Jared Johnson. He did capsule reviews of albums every week. Boy, did he go off on albums he didn't like. He said that Paul Simon and the Bee Gees were the greatest composers of the 20th century, but he ranted and raved against Alice Cooper and said that Black Sabbath was almost as bad as MC5. So I immediately went out and started looking for MC5 albums the next day. He found 2 of them for 25 cents at Trade-A-Tape. Despite a propensity for mentally warehousing large tracts of information and a fascination with printed and visual media, which would later manifest itself in the collage art that would accompany Dead Kennedy's records, music singularly inspired Biafra's love of words. Music lyrics are almost my entire literary background, he confirms. This seems to shock and annoy a hell of a lot of people, although Allen Ginsberg thought it was great and perfectly valid. At the very least, it helps me overcome my intellectual upbringing to hopefully better communicate to other people raised on music lyrics who don't really like to read. While still in Boulder, he roadied for Colorado's first punk band, the Ravers. They would subsequently relocate to New York, and eventually had a 1984 hit with 88 lines about 44 women for RCA under new name, The Nails. Irony fans will note that the A&Amp R-Link was Bruce Harris, the man credited with finally convincing Epic to release the Clash's debut album in America and invoking the epithet "the only band that matters." However, Biafra's first noteworthy musical venture was the Healers. They specialized in real scary music and did some tentative recording but never played live. "We never rehearsed," confirms Biafra. "It was me and John Greenway, and sometimes others banging on instruments we couldn't play when our parents weren't home. It was all improvised." Sensing the winds of change overseas, a trip to England in the summer of 1977 saw Biafra check out the local punk scene. He was able to attend shows by the Count Bishops and Little Bob Story, and caught an early wire gig supporting the Saints. He was so impressed by the latter, he had them sign a copy of I'm Stranded. On his return, he enrolled at the University of California at Santa Cruz that autumn to study drama and the history of Paraguay simply because they were the only classes left on offer. He tried to get into film school but didn't make the cut. Inspired by repeat spins of the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK, he had been amongst the first residents of Boulder to possess a copy. He cut off his hippie hair, placed it inside a Ziploc bag, and nailed the spurned locks to his dorm door. That was just inspiration, because I felt the hippie thing had run its course. They weren't causing enough of the right kind of trouble anymore. As soon as the hair went off, all of a sudden I felt dangerous again from the way people reacted. The bag of hair still exists. I've got it somewhere. I found it a while back. About 10 weeks was all he could stomach in a campus environment of pathetic deadheads with rich parents. He dropped out before completing his first semester, returning to Boulder to subsist by washing soiled laundry at a nursing home, which presented his very own "one flew over the cuckoo's nest" moment. A fascinating journey into hell, not least because he was appalled at the practices of some orderlies who traded in watches and other effects stolen from the unfortunate inmates. When San Francisco became his final port of call, he was primed to embrace the first West Coast American bands such as the Germs, Dills, Sleepers, and particularly the Screamers. When I moved back out, it took 2 days to get there. I happened to arrive on the night that the Nuns and Negative Trend were playing. Enthused, he put into action previously frustrated plans to start a new band by responding to Ray's advert. After all, one of the first people he'd met in San Francisco was Negative Trends Will Shatter. "Hey, you should be in a band," he informed Biafra. "I've been playing bass for only 3 days, and I'm in a band." The next respondent, after Biafra and Ray had kicked the band idea around for a month or so, was Klaus Floweride, aka Jeffrey Lyell. Like Ray, he was a time-served musician, having played in bands around New York and Boston for several years. In his native Detroit, he would regularly tape shows by some of that city's legendary performers. I had actually recorded early on people like MC5, Early Stooges, etc. At the Grand Ballroom, he says. They were fairly crude tapes, but pretty good. However, his entire cassette collection was stolen from his basement during a blackout. I'm sure they took it to a pawn shop, and the guy gave them $4 for the whole thing. The tapes, whoever got them, they probably erased them and put their Fleetwood Mac collection on it. But I definitely got to see a lot of that stuff fairly close up, and got to examine it. He was first drawn to music when his brother and sister started buying him records in the mid-50s. I saw Buddy Holly on TV. I saw Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I saw Jerry Lee Lewis and all that stuff. But it was Buddy Holly that made me ask my parents to get me a guitar for Christmas. I figured they'd get me a Stratocaster. That's what he was playing. And they got me this big old Stellar acoustic from Sears. And it had a neck on it like a horse's leg, and I was a little 8-year-old kid. And my fingers couldn't even fit around the neck. The guitar teacher got very frustrated and told my parents I'd never play. He started his own pirate radio station in Detroit before moving to Boston, where he studied communications. I had pirate radio stations in Detroit in 65/66 and in Boston from 71 to 74. In Detroit, it was WKMA for Kiss My Ass. Basically, we got bothered a whole bunch of times in Detroit, so we moved over to Canada, where the FCC Federal Communications Commission couldn't touch us, and the Canadian Board of Broadcasting didn't care one way or the other, because we weren't jamming anybody. And we'd get these letters entirely in red from the FCC. But we knew they couldn't do a thing. In Boston, it was WOOM the station, with immaculate reception. I was on Beacon Hill, so I had good range up the Charles River. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Harvard, Boston University, all those people on the river, in the dorms. When it started out in Detroit, we were playing everything from Lenny Bruce to Early Mothers to stuff like Iggy Pop. By the end of that station's existence, we had some MC5 and stuff like that. It was before freeform radio really happened out here. The transmitter came because we knew this guy who was a science freak. And he said, "Oh, I can build a transmitter." And he did. The first one was a World War II field radio that had a monster tube in the middle of it. It was supposed to broadcast in the short wave area. He just knocked it down to the AM band. But we had to turn it off 10 minutes in every hour because it would overheat. Then he built us a better one from scratch. Then when we moved to Canada, he built a 1,000-watt transmitter. But I don't have that one. That was left in Detroit with one of the other guys who ran the station with me. At the same time, he began playing in bands. When I first started playing in Boston, it was cover bands. Then there was this guy Billy Squeer, who played in Tom Swift and his Electric Grandma. He and I got together and had this group called Magic Terry and Amp, the Universe. It was inspired by things like MC5 and the Stooges, and was involved in the Warhol scene. Terry was a very charismatic front person who did not sing. He spoke everything. We had one gig, playing with 10 Years After. We were a Velvet Underground kind of group, and kids were there mostly to see a guy play very fast guitar. Terry had this song called Of America and the Entire Western World. It was a 7-minute song he played 8 different characters in. And towards the end of the set, Terry mooned the kids. We were supposed to be playing 3 or 4 days, but got booted off after the first night. The story that came back to New York was banned in Boston, and everyone got excited. But then it fizzled out. Both the record companies that were excited about it said, "We're not ready for you yet, we'll sign you in a year. Get the stuff together." We couldn't hold out for a year. We were 19-year-olds and didn't want to wait that long. At one point, Jim Morrison got Magic Terry a meeting with the Doors management team, but Terry was considered, even by that interlocutor's standards, too volatile. When that broke up, I started playing R&B and blues stuff. That's what basically I did for 10 years, playing in house blues bands. When blues masters came through, they'd use our bands. Albert Collins, John Lee Hooker, people like that would use us. Some people would practice, others would assume that we'd know their stuff. But we had our own side bands, R&B type bands. And it would get to the point where it would be a bunch of white guys challenging black guys to see who could drink more. I got tired of that, so I decided to check out California to see if it was different. I came out to visit in the Christmas of '76. The temperature was in the high 70s. A little drizzle, that's all. It turns out it was an incredible warm snap in San Francisco. I didn't know that. I thought that's just what California is like. I went back to Boston, and I was driving a cab at that point. We had some amazing snowstorms in Boston, which was really good for cabs because people would constantly flag you down from one stop to the next. You'd get $10 for taking someone half a mile. Then they'd tip you another 3, and there was someone else frantically flagging you down. So I made enough to buy a van and move out to San Francisco in May 1977. It was while driving cabs he first heard about punk. I got the first Ramones album for 50 cents. I took it home, played it, and laughed at it. I thought it was kind of funny but amateurish, and I poo-pooed it. But then I woke up the next morning with those tunes still running through my head. And I thought, that's curious, that it just needled its way into my brain that quickly. So I got to San Francisco. I was working as a temp, going out on Fridays for drinks with people. One of the places we'd go to was the Mabuhay. The first band I saw there that made an impression on me was the Zeros. They'd been based in San Diego and moved up to San Francisco. The people I was with were laughing at the whole thing, like what a joke. I sat there thinking, this is intense. This is what rock and roll used to be about when I was a kid. It was like Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis and all that stuff that scared my parents when we watched it on the Ed Sullivan Show. When Jerry Lee Lewis came on, my mother let out a sigh of relief, 'cause the guy looked like a classical musician sitting down at the piano. He sat down and then started playing. He plays a little wild, then he stood up and he threw his hair forward, and his whole hair comes flying out. My mom just said, "Oh my God," I was just glued to the television. And that's the kind of thing that I would say punk rock was doing again, whereas anything else going on in rock and roll in the mid to late 70s was not doing that. Shortly afterwards, he chanced across Ray's ad in Bay Area Musician. BAM was a magazine to fill up the void, so there was somebody to stroke bands on the local Jefferson Starship kind of level. It ignored punks. I was looking through the back of that, and there was a guy looking to form a punk band. And it said East Bay, which was the part of the Bay Area that Ray lives in Ray. And because I'd only been in San Francisco for a while and wasn't familiar with the terms, I wasn't sure if his name was East Bay or Ray or East Bay Ray. So I played it safe and called him Ray when we spoke on the phone. I told him that story about a year later, and that's when he settled on East Bay Ray. On the California Uber Alles single, he's Ray Valium. He made his way over to Ray's garage for the first practice session. The first thing Ray asked was, "Can you play Peggy Sue?" I had that one right down. It was one of the first things I learned on guitar. It was close to a regular punk progression. Ray wanted to play something that had that kind of sound, without being a Ramones song that you'd memorized. Let's not go to the garage and play Sheena is a punk rocker. Let's go to the garage and see if you can play the roots of Sheena is a punk rocker. I remember a phone conversation where I was mentioning the Residents and DeVoe influence. Most of the other people were just saying Sex Pistols and Ramones. It just showed that we had a drive to make it sound like something that would stand out and not just be generic sounding. And so began Dead Kennedys. Even today, the sight of their name can send the uninitiated into a fit of apoplexy. It was chosen to symbolize the end of the American dream and the beginning of the decline and fall of the American empire, a myth most exquisitely enshrined in the fate of the Kennedy clan. To most Americans, its invocation was, and remains, an act of sacrilege. Rather than playing to punk consensus, it was additionally a specific affront to the mainstream liberals of the Democratic Party. A good start, then. That moniker came from Biafra in a roundabout way. Given that his ability to coin band names is legendary, documented on his No More Cocoon spoken word album, it is somewhat surprising that its original source was a third party. Or rather, perhaps parties. It was suggested by two friends at the same party, remembers Biafra, one of whom was a guy called Rick Stott. Stott, later the DKS lawyer, had worked the counter at Trade A Tape, managed the Ravers, and would later join the staff at Maximum Rock and Roll radio show prior to its fanzine incarnation. The other one was Radio Pete aka Mark Bleesener, future New York rocker contributor and editor of Rocky Mountain Musical Express, who subsequently managed Lyle Lovett, Alan Parsons, and the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. The funny part is only a few years ago did Rick Stott tell me that he suggested that as a great band name after reading about another band called Dead Kennedys in Cleveland. Then our Dead Kennedys starts. Ray Farrell, who later ran SSD Records and was hired by Geffen, was working at a record store called Rather Ripped in Berkeley and said, "Yes, you guys are getting all this great press in Cleveland." And I thought, what? I picked up an issue of Clee, the fanzine that Pierre Ubu and the rest were covered in, and looked at it and realized that it was a completely different band. Had I known that there was another band of that name already, I would never have used it. In fact, the Cleveland Dead Kennedys had swiftly changed their name after they discovered the name was something of an impediment to getting live bookings. Dead Kennedys hard rock comic, originally published by Revolutionary Comics, reproduced by kind permission of J. Allen Sanford of Rock and Roll Comics. This issue, according to Sanford, was written by a woman who at the time was a sociology professor at DePaul University, where she used our comics in her courses. Words by Dina Dassine, artwork by Joe Paradise. In fact, Bleesener has a much clearer recollection of the provenance of what John Savage would acknowledge as the definitive punk name. Rick actually came up with Gang of Four before there was a Gang of Four, Bleesener recalls. Gang of Four was actually a name coincidentally suggested by Biafra. I had been toting the name around to some other bands as well. Word had gotten around. In about 1974, I had moved from Chicago to a cabin with no water, and my girlfriend was staying with me and had a teddy bear she called Ted Kennedy in honor of the senator. Just out of that came the notion one night when we were sitting around, Ted Kennedy, Dead Kennedy. What a great name for a band. It just kind of lay there. I have kept a running band name list forever. I've either been in or worked with bands my whole life. This just went on the list. Eventually, I moved back to Colorado from Los Angeles, where I was playing with and the Mysterians in 1976. In July, just after I'd moved in, I was doing some recording for fun, with the Dead Kennedys name in mind. I wrote a couple of songs. One was Just a Patsy, after Lee Harvey Oswald's famous line, and another one, Jackie's Song. I recorded those for the Bicentennial in 1976. For at that time, everyone in Colorado who appreciated Mott, the Dolls, the Velvets, the Stooges, Phil Spector, Pistols, the Damned, the Clash, we all ran into one another. I had a PA system, which I hired out for like $1.50 a time. One was the Ravers, whose drummer, Al Lays, would later audition for the Dead Kennedys after Ted departed, and hanging around that band was Eric, and a kid named Joseph Pope, later behind the Rocky Mountain Low compilation, and bass player of SSD band Angst. I remember we were all so passionate, that feeling that if we didn't seize control and get some three-chord rock out there, it would disappear and become a museum piece. I ended up going to Eric's parents' house, to his boyhood bedroom, and brought my cassette recorder. I was taping singles he'd brought back from the UK. We couldn't get them here yet. Cortinas, vibrators, X-ray specs, I think. I was just taping off his record player and probably preaching the gospel of Phil Spector. I recall saying to him, I have the greatest name for a band that nobody could ever use. It just lay there. I was totally surprised when I heard about that first Dead Kennedys show in 1978. How cool. Someone actually used that name. Biafra had to employ a little subterfuge to get his own way, however. When I suggested Dead Kennedys, Ray and Klaus objected so strongly, I knew I was onto something. So I told the Dills, Negative Trend, and others that Dead Kennedys was our name, and Ray and Klaus couldn't get rid of it. They immediately started writing songs together, but their memories of the methodology vary wildly. I had one of those $10 cassette recorders, Ray states. Different songs were written different ways, but Biafra would say his words into the cassette, and I'd record them, and find some chord changes later, or something would happen right then. Then later I gave him cassettes with guitar riffs, melody lines, and chords. He would rummage through his booklet of lyrics and find one that fit. Another way that songs would happen would be that we were jamming together and record it, which is how Holiday in Cambodia came about. This is not how Biafra recollects the development of the songs at all, although Cambodia is an exception. He is adamant that the concepts for the vast majority of songs were his, and they were not only lyrics, but came with his ideas on the riffs and music that should accompany them. I never once handed Ray any lyrics to make into a song, he maintains. The only time I ever did that with anybody was the one time with Carlos. Carlos Cadona, aka 6025, was the band's temporary second guitarist, whom everyone in the band seems to refer to affectionately as eccentric. I was hanging around with Carlos, Biafra continues, and we both liked really weird music and were hot to be in a band. Then his band Mailman broke up. So I said, why not just join our band? Ray remembers 6025 as someone they know from local shows. He played guitar, so we started playing with him. He added that Captain Beefheart / Frank Zappa overtone to things. Biafra didn't, at this stage, have much in the bank in the way of lyrics. I actually had very little. I was new to the whole thing. It sort of occurred to me late in the game that if I was going to be in a band, it would help to have songs. If I wanted good lyrics, I was going to have to write them myself. It became a case of trial and error. At first, it was mainly me walking in with complete songs. I'd play them single string on a guitar to show them to Ray. Then later, Ray brought in one of his own, Your Emotions. The very first time I met Ray, I went over there with my guitar and showed him the song that became Capone Factory, later released on In God We Trust, Inc., originally called Capone Kids. Originally, it was the more cliched title, Capone Kids. The second one I brought in was a song we never released, called Kidnap. The latter concerned the case of Patty Hearst, who served time for aiding and abetting her kidnappers, self-styled left-wing guerrillas the SLA, in an armed robbery. The lyrics were printed in Search and Destroy, but we didn't save the song and put it on Fresh Fruit. I think I wrote that after I got to San Francisco. The third song was California, Uber Alles. That was one of the few that, rather than have the music in my head, I actually blundered into the verse riff while playing around with my roommate's bass one night. The other parts came later. The original draft of California had been written with old Boulder friend John Greenway, who actually performed the song alongside Biafra as part of the Healers. Greenway wrote the words after listening, voluntarily or otherwise, to Biafra's discourse on State Governor Jerry Brown. 5. The chorus, with Biafra's distinctive vibrato/warble, once dubbed a human theremin, was inspired by Japanese kabuki music. Although the timing of the chorus seemed perfectly logical to me, it took the other guys a month to get the timing right. It's not in any conventional sheet music timing, or anything. I don't worry about that, I just make the stuff up. Ray is pretty animated in disputing this. Here's the problem, when there's stuff that I do, it's always the band. When there's stuff that Biafra does, it's always himself. That's how Biafra spins things. He won't give credit to anybody else in the band. Everybody in the band was like that. I feel we all work to make the songs as good as possible. The problem is that he says this, and this. And the other people, if they don't put something equally in, it looks like he's doing it all. Biafra's much more comfortable talking about himself than Klaus or myself are. We're much more laid-back, low-key people. He's a lead singer. Lead singers speak in I a lot. Klaus really was instrumental in the songwriting, but he won't take credit for it. Every time Biafra says his, Klaus and I is what he's talking about. I have a balance issue on that one, because we all really work to make the songs. Biafra insists that beyond these early efforts, he never had a booklet of lyrics to rummage through. To this day, I never finish anything unless I'm going to use it. There were cassettes with his riffs on it that Ray gave me later. Those riffs are sprinkled into the songs on subsequent Dead Kennedys albums, Plastic Surgery Disasters, and Frankenchrist. A little bit on Bedtime for Democracy. They are all credited accordingly. At least they were before they lied and changed all the songwriting credits. But Fresh Fruit, the original credits, most of the songs were written by me. If I hadn't brought them in, arranged and all, they would not exist. They did not dispute those original credits for 20 years. What all those early songs did have, right from the outset, was lashings of sarcasm. I think humor can be a powerful weapon. Why else was Charlie Chaplin run out of the United States during the Red Scare and McCarthy era? ImGalt equals image, SRC equals images/29. JPG/mutants play Napa State Mental Hospital, 1978. Brendan Sue Fritz, Sally, Charlie and John Mutant. Photographed by Ruby Ray, Search and Destroy Headquarters, 1977. Vale's apartment in North Beach. Photographed by Ruby Ray. Chapter 2 In a Desperate Mind. Little Gardens Grow Shut Up You Animals Dirk Dirksen, 1937-2006. Ringmaster of the Circus of the Creatively Inspired and Willfully Deranged. Presided as Pope of Punk over nightly excursions into living theater on the premises 1974-1984 at Nesakino's Mabuhay Gardens, previously a Filipino supper club. He opened the lid on society's garbage, can of new talent to look for truth and beauty that gave rise to San Francisco's counterculture music scene. Plaque commemorating Dirk Dirksen, Say Goodnight Dirk. You can say what you want, but how many people have been willing to put up with you and us for 7 or 8 years? On-stage dedication by Biafra to Dirksen, recorded on the introduction to Police Truck, on the bootleg Never Been on MTV, D. Kennedys made their live debut on a bill headed by the Offs at Nesakino's Mabuhay Gardens. Sandwiched between a row of strip joints and booked by Dirk Dirksen, the venue is held in similar esteem to New York's CBGB, London's Roxy, and LA's Mask as one of the key formative locales in punk history. If you were in a band in 1975 or 1976, Jeff Raphael of the Nuns would tell James Stark in his book Punk 77, you had to be in what the local scene was at that time, or there was nowhere to play. That's why we started the Mabuhay. There was nowhere for anybody to go. We had to create our own place to hang out, so that's what we did. Before Mabuhay, I never hung out in clubs because there wasn't a club scene. With the Mabuhay, you just went there. You didn't care who was playing because you went to hang out. Dirksen, a former tour manager for Ray Charles and the Doors, was renowned for baiting his audiences to amp gigs prior to performance, his faithful pooch dummy tucked under his arm as he traded insults with bands. He claimed to have had his nose broken several times as a result, and in one incident Michael Kowalski, mentor of UXA, smashed his cash register and snapped his glasses. Dirksen eventually let him back in the club after UXA. Singer and girlfriend de Detroit negotiated a deal whereby the cost of his glasses would be recouped from Kowalski's social security check. Dirk told me he insulted all the bands as a way of treating everyone equally and not playing favorites, Biafra confirms, who also credits him with being the impetus behind all ages shows. I was never carded when I went to punk shows in London as a 19-year-old in '77. The key in San Francisco was Dirk. All Mabuhay shows were all ages. As a consequence, an atmosphere somewhere between camaraderie and confrontation prevailed at the Fab Mab. They had a meeting every month where representatives of each band were supposed to go down and dicker with Dirk Dirksen about who wanted a gig, recalls Biafra, who could play with whom, etc. It was more of a free-for-all than negotiation. I was a pretty low man on the totem pole because we'd never played and no one had actually seen us. I was already a known guy on the scene, though. I pogo danced a little wilder than most, which annoyed some people, but sometimes I would jump off the front of the stage while another band was playing. Not a true stage dive, 'cause the stage wasn't high enough. Part of what drew people to see us the first time was, oh, this guy has a band now. Let's see what this is. A view confirmed by local photographer Ruby Ray. I do remember that we were all wondering what Biafra would do as we, the other hardcore, had seen him around at all the shows. He did sleep on our living room floor for a few months when he ran for mayor. Biafra as the local nutter. Yeah, considered the local nutter, especially by the Dills and the Nuns. Unfortunately, two important bands broke up right before we debuted. So it was fortunate for us, but not for a very good reason, because we'd lost the Sleepers, one of my all-time favorite bands, as well as UXA. So people were hungry for a new band. Plus, the scene was thriving but quite small, so people would get bored if they saw the same band with everybody they knew in them time after time, and nobody came up with anything new. What especially made it different from later punk underground scenes, and especially the above-ground scenes of today, the pressure was not on every band to sound the same and please the audience and cater to their expectations. The pressure was on every band to sound different, to offer something fresh. If you completely fucked with people, metallic KO or negative trend style, so much the better. Dirksen requested a bio and a glossy photo. Since at the time we didn't have a drummer, Biafra continues, we borrowed Carlos and he posed as the drummer. To this day, Carlos/6025 is routinely credited as the band's first percussionist, doubtless due to that first promotional photograph. Dirk Dirksen did all the booking and promotion at the club, explains Ray. He made it what it was. He said he needed an 8x10 glossy. He was trying to train us a bit on the business side of the music biz. All Dirk would hand me was a gig opening for an eccentric metal band, Biafra continues, Magister Ludi, and a poppy new wave band, The Beans. Carlos and I were shaking our heads over that one. Oh shit, we all have to start somewhere, but why this? So I went back to Billy Hawk, guitarist of the Offs, and begged him to give us a better show. And so he put us on one of the Offs shows as a fourth band. Usually there were only 3. But that was a much better slot because it was us, and Negative Trend, and another band called DV8 before the Offs played. The Offs rescued us from probably having to battle another 6 months to get seen by the right people. They'd already tried out various drummers, including one, the pseudonymous Raul Num, who appeared on the practice tape that Ray recorded in order to secure the Mabuhay gig. We had one drummer that came dressed in a bondage harness, Ray recalls. Presumably, he'd read about UK punk fashion. No, he might have actually been into it. He had really long hair, but he had this special water. He was kind of an organic bondage dude. Biafra can't recall anyone auditioning in bondage harness, but the long-haired guy Raul G. Jono Akajin Gino Reimer had a swastika pendant. The trivia part is that he played in a band before called Loose Gravel. They have a bit of a name because it was the band Mike Wilhelm did after the Charlatans, before he joined the Flamin' Groovies. Then he later called up Ray and complained about me, wanting Ray to kick me out because he thought I was a redneck. The sad part is, he was a really good drummer. But he really didn't get us. Never saw him in another band. With the search becoming more frantic, enter Ted, aka Bruce Schlesinger, a graduate of New York's Pratt Institute of Architecture and the final piece in the jigsaw. "I'd just moved out here from the East," Ted recalls. "I had a job here working in an architect's office, just doing drafting and that sort of thing. I came to San Francisco and put my name up on a bulletin board looking for other musicians. I get a call from Klaus. Was I interested in joining Dead Kennedys, or at least coming round for a tryout? Since I hadn't heard from anybody else, I said okay. Like the other musicians in the band, Ted brought experience to bear. I first started playing drums when I was around 12. I would play in the band and the school orchestra. Then my parents bought me a used drum set. I played that for a while and really got into it. Then I started playing with friends. I played once in the Café Wa in New York, which was a club in the village. I wasn't serious about it when I was 14 or 15. It was just fun with friends, that's all." He'd actually spotted Ray's ad previously in Aquarius Records, but passed. Yeah, the ad said Dead Kennedys looking for drummer. It was in a local record store. I saw this name and thought, I'm not going to call them with that name. Then I put my own ad up. Then Klaus called me. It turned out better. At that time, there were a lot of really terrible bands, people looking to play with other musicians. A lot of people were just starting up. Anyone who could play 2 chords was trying to form a band at the time. I was pleasantly surprised when I got to their audition, and I thought Ray and Klaus were great musicians. The appreciation was mutual. He was the first person who rushed us on one of the songs, says Klaus. Everyone else was dragging. Bruce actually rushed us ahead of the beat. So I just handed him a beer and said, "Do you want to be in the group?" And he said sure, and that was that. So then we practiced 5 days a week or something to get ready for that show. Ted's recall of that first meeting is similar. I think it was at Ray's house, the first audition. They said to me afterwards, "You're the first drummer who can keep up with us. Are you interested in playing next week? We have a gig." What did Ted make of the songs? They just seemed very quick. They were decent enough and it was fun just to play. Ray's primary emotion was relief. Bruce only joined a week before the show. But luckily, he's a very talented drummer. We were auditioning different drummers in my garage. I still only live a block from where it all started. The garage has been torn down, unfortunately. So we rehearsed there, but once we got a drummer, the neighbors started noticing. We had to move. Carlos, aka 6025, had been inducted into the band just before as a guitarist and had the same 5 days grace prior to their live debut. Dead Kennedys duly made their debut at Mabuhay Gardens on 19 July 1978. With the growing popularity of the Fab Mab, San Francisco had its first settled venue for punk acts. A big part of the reason was because its food license allowed under 21s to attend. It worked something like this. The venue was indeed a restaurant until about 11 p.m., at which time the patrons would be kicked out and a very different crowd ushered in. 3 hours of music and drinking would ensue. The reason punk scenes didn't start as early in a lot of American cities, notes Biafra, is because there weren't all-ages venues. So it was more like a bar band playing Fleetwood Mac covers, 4 sets a night for the burnt-out adults. That was all local music was allowed to be, including in my hometown, where it was country rock instead, and everyone wanted to be the next Eagles. The show proved to all concerned that they were on to something. The Mabuhay was as big as you could get in San Francisco, recalls Ray, because Blondie had played there back in the day, stuff like that. The thing I remember is that we didn't have a complete set, we had a 20-minute set. But we were so excited, we played that 20-minute set in 50 minutes. Klaus, too, was blown away. We even got an encore as an opening band, and there were a lot of other bands on the bill. So we had to go out and repeat Rawhide or something like that, because we didn't have anything else. Biafra reckons the set was over in just 11 minutes, and the encore was Man with the Dogs, which hadn't been part of the main set. It was really wild, a lot of fun, enthuses Ted. We immediately got a great reception. It was very encouraging, and we got a high coming off stage. We did play real fast, and we got a great response. The band just immediately took off from that point. It was pretty exciting. They played regularly thereafter in San Francisco, though the notoriety of their name necessitated some variance in billing. The Creamsicles and Pink Twinkies were two flags of convenience, though, contrary to reports elsewhere, they were never known as the Sharks. They were used once each to play high school dances incognito, Biafra recalls. First one worked, second one didn't. The Sharks was what Ray wanted to call the band itself. The aforementioned Creamsicles show, organized at Moraga High School as a Christmas dance under the flag of the Whittlers Club, a sanctioned but inactive fraternity, ended up as a sneak punk rock bill with sudden fun and the Zeros supporting. The image that remains, stated John Marr later of Maximum Rock and Roll and San Francisco punk oral history Gimme Something Better, is the band playing their music while Biafra is being dragged around in the back of the cafeteria. It was great fun. Their third show at the Mabuhay resulted in a mass of broken furniture and a lecture from Dirksen about violating the theater of illusion. At a show at Project One, Aka the Pit, the hippie commune living there, objected to the audience who turned out to see the DKs, Mutants, and KGB. Promoter Paul Ratbakovich would subsequently move his operations to 330 Grove Street and continue, but the Pit gig is notable for hosting the first public enactment of the Biafra. Anyone who has seen the vocalist live will know he likes to act out his creations, physically inhabiting the personas of power-drunk preachers, corrupt businessmen, and politicians. The Biafra saw audience members clamber on stage and attempt to imitate same, like a rowdy, tongue-in-cheek chorus line. The name inevitably continued to cause complications. Among those to balk at their disrespect for America's leading family was Pulitzer Prize-winning news columnist Herb Keane. In 1978, he wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle, "Just when you think tastelessness has reached its nadir, along comes a punk rock group called the Dead Kennedys, which will play at Mabuhay Gardens on November 22, the 15th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination." Despite mounting protests, the owner of Mabuhay says, "I can't cancel them now, there's a contract." Not, apparently, the kind of contract some people have in mind. Of course, not for the last time in the band's history, the hysterics of the press simply furthered their cause. The Mabuhay received several bomb threats, and there was a fire truck stationed ominously outside on the night, but the venue was packed. As Biafra put it, every weird mind around crawled out of the woodwork to see us. The reality was that Dirksen did originally cancel the band, but only in order to book a show by jazz legend Sun Ra. But then Herb Keane complained, so he had to bring us back, chortles Biafra. Sun Ra played first, then the door charge was dropped, and we played. The reaction of the black Muslims from the Sun Ra audience in their bow ties, trying to flee the room as fast as possible, was priceless. Sun Ra liked us though. Search and Destroy was the estimable San Franciscan punk digest founded by V. Vale, who had formerly worked alongside poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti at the City Lights bookshop The Model, on which Jeff Travis founded Rough Trade in the UK. When he announced his decision to start a punk fanzine in Christmas 1976, both Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg helped out with finance. Search and Destroy ran the first major profile of the band in September 1978, under a fake San Francisco Chronicle strapline. Alongside lyrics and photos of the original five-piece lineup, the group presented a list of influences including the Stooges, Silver Apples, Mick Farren, Hawkwind, Beefheart, Red Crayola, and John Cooper Clarke, as well as contemporary peers F-Word, the Deadbeats, and Half Japanese. In the interview, Biafra set an admirable precedent by addressing any number of political topics, with band promotion lagging a poor second. Gladhand, 1978. Biafra often acted like a politician. The audience's reaction was paramount. Photographed by Ruby Ray, The Girls' Bathroom at the Mab, 1978. Sally Webster from the Mutants, and everyone hung out there. Photographed by Ruby Ray, Dead Kennedys' first recording sessions were undertaken at San Francisco's long-established Different Fur Studios under the sponsorship of Bruce Conner, a respected artist from the Beat era who also took photos for Search and Destroy. His 1965 art film, Report, featured recurring footage of JFK's motorcade and had been played without the band's consent as the backdrop to their Mabuhay Gardens show on T. He anniversary of his assassination. All of a sudden he wanted to be a producer, Ted remembers. He paid for some sessions that we did at this very good recording studio called Different Fur. Between Biafra and Bruce, they never really saw eye to eye. It was slightly overproduced and didn't really capture the essence of the band, and the recording went nowhere. According to Klaus, the results were incredibly slow versions in retrospect. Biafra adds, "Yeah, they were slower, hardcore hadn't hit yet. I listened to them a few years later, and I thought they were cool. They reminded me of Joy Division. It was a dream came true that fell out of the sky," laments Biafra, but turned out to be not what we thought it would be. Bruce Connor decided he wanted to start producing bands. And he picked us and got a deal where he'd trade art to studio owner and electronic musician Patrick Gleason of Different Fur in exchange for giving studio time. We thought things were sounding pretty good. But then Connor did a very different mix of California Uber Alles while we weren't there that sounds far more like DeVoe than Dead Kennedys. We didn't like that. He said it was a producer's right to interpret a band any way he wishes. We didn't agree, so then he got all mad at our mix and said he wouldn't let any of the stuff come out. To this day it still hasn't. Bootlegs confirm that at this stage, Dead Kennedy's repertoire lacked the bite, spite, and particularly the pace of the finished models. But illicitly circulated tapes of the band's demos offer worthy investigations into the development of the song cycle that led to Fresh Fruit. The origin of those recordings has long been held a mystery, though Ray has a theory that the source may be a recording studio that was next door to a rehearsal room they used. Biafra isn't having that. Why does Ray make up these stupid stories? He recorded the 78 demos himself on a high-quality cassette machine in March '79. We called it Carlos's Last Stand because it was his last practice before he left the band, and we wanted to get everything we knew on tape for posterity. Then we played the Def Club gig, and he was gone. Certainly sound quality would indicate, as opposed to the Different Fur recordings, that the 78 demos were rehearsal sessions never intended for public scrutiny. And yet they offer up a series of clues and footnotes. Forward to Death features an almost conventional rock guitar solo at its close. California Uber Alles is structurally similar to the familiar version, though, as on the take of Kill the Poor, the vocals sound as if Biafra is on the verge of a hernia. While Your Emotions features an extended outro, the effects damage that turned up on the intro to the album version of Holiday in Cambodia is present, if lacking in the sullen menace. On this and several other takes, the vocals are almost whispered or talk-sung, rather than employing the stridency one usually equates with Biafra. The lyrics on Cambodia are different, too. The section of the couplet bragging that you know how the niggers feel cold is herein swapped for a less visceral, less contentious Blacks live bootlegs confirm that this was the preferred vernacular at early shows. There are also slightly altered lyrics to I Kill Children, though it's the one song, alongside the cover of Viva Las Vegas, that comes close to replicating the urgency of its Fresh Fruit incarnation. Of the unreleased songs, B-Flag, as it is mistakenly labeled, is an early version of Capone Factory. Take Down offers a standard punk riff with Biafra conducting as deranged cheerleader, while Cold Fish is the nearest the band would come to straight Ramon's Pastich, by way of Johnny Moped. But the real surprises are undercover, Aka Dreadlocks of the Suburbs, a tongue-in-cheek flirtation with reggae, and a weird, loopy, avant-jazz instrumental, Psychopath, which reveals and revels in 6025's debt to Beefheart. Psychopath is actually Mexican Monster Babies, states Biafra, which is also a Healer's song. I pulled it after Carlos quit and John Greenway asked me not to use any more Healer's songs. So I didn't. However, Carlos's time with the band was coming to an end. He would leave after a final show at the Def Club on 3 March 1979. The set was retrospectively released in 2004 as Live at the Def Club. He would return to play a guest role on Fresh Fruit. Flyer for Dead Kennedys at the Def Club, 3 March 1979. Flyer for Dead Kennedys, Controllers and Young Adults, Saturday 25 November 1979, at Ados, Berkeley, CA. Img alt equals I. Mage SRC equals images/43. JPG/portions of the collage poster given away with Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, designed by Jello Biafra. Chapter 3, You Will Jog for the Master Race. California is a queer place in a way. It has turned its back on the world and looks into the void Pacific. It is absolutely selfish, very empty but not false, and at least not full of false effort. W.H. Lawrence, after the frustrations of the Different Fur sessions, the band repaired to a local studio to prepare its debut single. The key problem was the means of distribution. There were few A&R men falling over themselves to sign a band of their type, never mind one with such a cultural hand grenade of a name. There weren't any deals to be had, relates Biafra. The major labels had pulled the plug on their relationship with punk in early 1978, breaking the hearts of many of the key bands at the time who thought they were going to be signed. Everybody from the Weirdos and Screamers in LA to the Avengers, Nuns, Crime, Dills, etc. in San Francisco. In fact, the odd unconsummated dalliance aside, no major label obliged an American punk band's dance card between the Dickies in 1978, A&M, and Husker Du Warner's in 1985, and even then, only after Husker Du's sound had changed substantially. Punk was over, apparently, though no one had told Dead Kennedys, or more particularly, Biafra. It wasn't over. It was one of those times that hits any musician every once in a while. You either play because you like to play, or you don't play at all. You don't play to get signed. You don't play to get big or famous. You play because you want to play. When I moved out to San Francisco, my goal was, as a record collector, to get my name on one 7-inch single and be able to tell my grandkids I actually saw bands like the Dills and the Avengers and the Ramones in clubs before they were playing stadiums. The band responded by setting up its own label, under the now familiar name Alternative Tentacles. There were few other options contrary to some reports. There were no expressions of interest from major labels in the band until Fresh Fruit had sold so well in Britain. By this time, the independent scene in the UK was well established, with Rough Trade, Chiswick, Beggar's Banquet, and others leading the charge, but that was not the case in America. The first punk-era independent in San Francisco had opened, but Aquarius owner Chris Knabb and promoter Howie Klein's 415 Records had financial ties to promoter Bill Graham, almost universally despised by punks, which would soon be co-opted by Columbia in any case. After initial releases by the Nuns and Mutants, it turned away from punk to concentrate on new wave acts, notably Romeo Void. Howie Klein with Sire Records, he's the one promoting new wave/skinny tie bands, remembers Ray. But he was anti-punk. And he was against us at the beginning. He wanted to promote the skinny tie/My Sharona type band and bands like Blondie. Don't get me wrong, Blondie were a great band. I'm not saying new wave is bad. But Howie Klein thought punk would never go anywhere in the States, and we need to promote new wave. Now he acts like he was there helping us out all the time. Oh, the hypocrisy. But he was telling us to tone our music down and make it more new wave. Now he's saying he was there, supporting us 100%. Biafra has a more charitable view of Klein. He did not hate punk, he was desperate to find his own clash. But the Dills rejected him, so he settled for the Red Rockers. Industry guy, yes, but it was he who got Sire to release Ice-T's rap metal fusion act Body Count's Cop Killer, and got Warner's to let Ministry make Land of Rape and Honey. He is also one of the few industry insiders to publicly picket former Washington wife and censorship campaigner Tipper Gore. He's still an activist. Subterranean Records, started by Mike Fox and Steve Tupper, would subsequently help fill the void and specifically gave license to San Franciscan punk bands. But a whole swat of great music was lost in the interim. How I wish I could have had a label 2 years earlier, Biafra laments, and put out all the great albums waiting to happen in the San Francisco area. The Avengers could have made at least 3, and my favorite band of all, the Screamers based in Los Angeles, never even made a record at all. California Uber Alles was released in June 1979 and was an entirely homespun creation. We did the California Uber Alles single by ourselves, Ray recalls. I remember shipping it off to Texas and having it shipped back to our house. Ted, who designed the original cover, and I sold it out of the back of our cars. After selling out of initial quantities, it was re-released by Optional. California Uber Alles was framed around the specter of Governor Jerry Brown's ascent. Brown was an ambitious politician with an ostensibly left-leaning agenda, including advocacy of Buddhist economics. Biafra originally considered him as dangerous as Nixon, only less likely to make dumb mistakes. The song's lyric Big Bro on White Horse was paraphrased directly from one of his speeches. What the American people are looking for is a man on a big white horse, which made a good fit with the song's self-evident Orwellian references, and, in retrospect, with the punk community's anguish over the major label versus independent issue. Revealingly, Brown's early career was sponsored by David Geffen, the man whose company benefited most from Nirvana, and the second coming of punk in the 90s. Brown also had a very public dalliance with Linda Ronstadt. The Eagles' Jane Fonda, later referenced in Kill the Poor, and Francis Ford Coppola numbered among Brown's supporters. Other references to Zen fascists in the song recall Biafra's adolescence in Boulder, where the idealism of the 60s retreated to the greed of the 70s, garbed in fake hippie mysticism. In essence, it's a spiritual heir to Zappa's, Who Needs the Peace Corps from We're Only in It for the Money, the song that ridiculed San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury hippies. There's also a nod to Ingmar Bergman's 1977 Nazi-themed film, The Serpent's Egg, itself a reference to a Brutus quote in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar concerning the emperor. The B-side, Man with the Dogs, profiled another character from Boulder, whose daily routine consisted of freaking out the town's residents by stopping and staring deep into their eyes, exactly the type of vacant stranger who customarily fascinated Biafra. 5. The ending of Man with the Dogs, a kind of bespoke 60s garage psych with Ray's Echoplex skewering a repeated chord phrase into sonic oblivion, was an early indication that the band were not going to limit themselves to 4/4 punk. Jerry Brown's politics would, perversely, eventually move closer to Biafra's own. Jim Carroll, the late former punk musician and author of the Basketball Diaries, told me he'd spotted Brown at the Savoy Cafe in North Beach and ran across the street to Recycle Records and bought the single and gave it to him while he was governor, Biafra recalls. We didn't hear anything from that. Many years later, Brown had veered very, very sharply to the left and beyond, and we were both working with Earth First. I encountered filmmaker Michael Moore at a speaking engagement in San Francisco. We all went over to an Oakland warehouse space where Jerry Brown's people were serving a big dinner for everybody. One of the people working with Jerry who lived at his place came down and said, "Oh, yeah, Jerry, this is Jello. I played Jerry your song this morning. I have no idea what shade of red my face turned." He seemed more or less understanding. For Ted, they never surpassed the original California Uber Alles. That, to me, was the greatest. It was a great recording. It was much rawer than the different Fur sessions. I think that track still sounds better than the one that's on Fresh Fruit. It was just a local recording studio, in the basement of Jim Keeler's house in San Francisco. Keeler, a much-liked San Francisco musician who had previously played in Blue Cheer precursors the Oxford Circle, was in the process of establishing his Army Street studios, which for some time would become a fixture of the local music community. He was the engineer along with Ray, I guess, Ted continues. But the sound was great. It was exciting. I found it had a lot more punch than the version we finally did on Fresh Fruit. The drumming was a little bit more unique, in part because the song had sped up so much from when we first did it till we finally did it for Fresh Fruit. By that time, it was difficult to do all those parts at twice the pace. Biafra, who once had the stated ambition of collecting every punk record ever made, had been won over by an early UK obscurity by the users, Sick of You, housed on Cambridge's Raw Records imprint. He went to the trouble of bringing the single into the studio to show Jim Keeler the sound he wanted to achieve in the final mix, but Ray's guitar setting was so different, we didn't have a chance. He agrees with Ted, however, on the primacy of that take of the song. Yeah, I think the single versions of all our songs are better than the album versions. But I noticed that with other albums of the time, that the album version of the song rarely sounds as good as the single. The first time you record a song, especially if you've never recorded before, you're giving it everything you've got. And Jim Keeler went the extra mile to make it a good-sounding record. And re-recording California, Uber Alles, and Holiday in Cambodia was kind of a drag. Wait a minute, we've done this already. Of all the DK's back catalog, California Uber Alles has enjoyed the most intriguing afterlife, partly because Biafra has continually updated it. 6. Within a year of Fresh Fruit's release, it had become We've Got a Bigger Problem Now on In God We Trust, Inc., reflecting the election of Ronald Reagan as president. That was just a result of the band goofing off at practice and at sound check, notes Biafra. We'll shatter from Flipper, who was one of our harshest critics and one of everybody's harshest critics. He said, "You're always so stiff, playing the same way, why don't you play it that way?" So it just wound up becoming an alternate version. Given that California has seen fit to elect an increasingly surreal roll call of governors, it is no surprise that the investiture of Arnie Schwarzenegger in 2003 gave Biafra ammunition to revise the lyric once again. It would be reimagined as California Uber Alles 21st Century with both the Melvins. A live version was included on their second collaboration with Biafra, 2006 is Sieg Howdy, and his current band, the Guantanamo School of Medicine, that he is able therein to incorporate an approximation of the Austrian's comedy kraut accent provides too delicious an irony to forego. The phrase itself has now slipped into common parlance. The American-German author Jiro Hašek wrote a, so far unfilmed, though Biafra gave his blessing screenplay with the title, after titling his Zeit magazine article on the Golden State in its honor. Then there was the bizarre episode in 2010 when a right-wing commentator mischievously, we have to assume, no one being that stupid, insisted that California Über Alles was the perfect theme song for the Meg Whitman Republican campaign, in which she faced down and lost to our old friend Jerry Brown. The very first single the band released in 1979 will make any California conservative's heart sing, I assure you, gushed Chip Hanlon. The calculated shitstorm that ensued ensured that Ray would appear on his radio show to put the record straight. The band continued to play live wherever they could. Their first expeditionary tour of the East Coast was an unheard of venture for a Californian punk band, including a particularly memorable set at the Rat in Boston. First the beer pitchers and trays flew, Biafra recalls. Then the furniture flew. When we came back for our second set, everyone backed up, standing against the walls. The only band I'd ever heard of that got a reaction like that was the Stooges. So I was very proud that evening, one of my all-time favorite gigs. Welcome to the West Coast, motherfuckers. The story about him being beat up by an indignant waitress included on the 25th anniversary DVD of Fresh Fruit is, unfortunately, untrue. She scratched my chest big deal then fled the room. They also played Max's Kansas City in New York opening for the Voodoo Shoes, a singularly inappropriate billing. That tour was a drag, Biafra laments, because it wasn't all ages in the U.S. Northeast. It was a horrible bar band, seen with tables and chairs. Maybe someone would get up and dance with their date, and yuck. It was in early '81, fresh off the UK success, that we were in bigger venues finally, and had the clout to demand the shows be all ages. Critics ridiculed it as a gimmick. But those kids started hardcore bands, and the critics were out of a job. The trip also proved a financial disaster. We went to New York and lost our shirt on the flights, notes Ray. When I got back, Bob Last, founder of Edinburgh's Fast Product, called me and said he wanted to put California out. Jim Foret of a club called Hurrahs had hosted Bob in New York and played him a whole bunch of records, Biafra recalls. The ones that Bob Last liked the most were California Über Alles, Middle Class's debut EP, and another San Francisco duo called No Mercy. Those were the three he dug. And California Über Alles already existed as a kick-ass single, so he had something to release without having to record or pay for it. I was pretty blown away because I grasped how important Fast Product was at that time. People were waiting with bated breath for the next Fast single after he'd sprung the Gang of Four, the Meccans, Human League, Scars, and others. Bob Last deserves a thank you. Without him, Dead Kennedys would have been gone within a year and a half. I felt like I was swept into it because it all happened so quickly, says Klaus. All of us probably had the feeling of that in some way. We had some slow times. Our first East Coast tour was a dreadful mess. When we came back from it, things picked up again. Indeed, no one in the band has particularly fond memories of this period. We'd done an East Coast tour and gone to New York as total unknowns, remembers Biafra. It might have been too soon. I went through culture shock. Some of the other guys, you start to learn a little bit more about everybody that way, and I wasn't liking what I was seeing. The guys who'd played in bar bands were acting like that again, and I was like, well, maybe we're done, but I'll wait and see if the single goes anywhere. Then it did. I knew it was a really good record, the songs were good, and the sound itself was more powerful than a lot of other homemade punk singles coming out at that time. Last, whose Fast Product did indeed produce a near peerless run of singles before he safeguarded the label's mystique by closing the label early, remembers it slightly differently. Jim Foret was a good friend at the time. I went over to New York and stayed with him, but actually Dead Kennedys was completely coincidental to that. No Mercy and Middle Class were both things that critic John Savage drew to my attention, which I loved. The Dead Kennedys, I think I heard I'm not sure that John Peel didn't call me up. At that time, we were very close with Peel. I probably phoned him up during his show, who the fuck are these people, what is their number? That's my recollection. Biafra admits he can't recall whether Last called him and mentioned Foret first or vice versa. In one of the band's first mainstream press notices, Sounds proclaimed the single Wagnerian punk with production as dirty as a bear's bum. California was to be the label's final release, despite it being its most successful. I can remember thinking it was a really funny, cool song, recalls John Langford of fellow fast artists the Meccans, but we were in the throes of moving off fast to a major. Bob was very keen on that. I got the impression he was pretty over running a label. Last confirms that to be the case. We just picked California up because it was the perfect thing to end that series of singles on. You couldn't have had a better high to go out on. My partner Hillary and I did have some discussion about doing an album, but it wasn't that I wasn't interested in their album. It was that I wasn't interested enough in albums at that time. It wasn't what the label was about. It was about these special moments. According to Biafra, Bob last did offer to follow the single with a 12-inch EP, but we didn't want to do that. We had enough good songs for an album, and America needed another strong underground punk album. Only the Germs had done it. We even looked into getting Kenny Laguna to produce us because the Germs LP sounded so good, but it didn't happen. It all came together, with Biafra and Klaus and 6025, and Ted through serendipity, says Ray. Everybody was at the right place at the right time. First with California Uber Alles as a single, then Biafra ran for mayor, which was a great gimmick. We kind of became the #1 punk band in San Francisco, even though we were really the third-generation one. Biafra remains adamant that serendipity, to use Ray's vernacular, and happenstance were key to the DKs becoming Californian punk's hottest export. It was something that we had to handle very carefully in the hometown. Here we'd had this random stroke of luck that had eluded the Avengers, Dills, X, Weirdos on down. I've always tried to look at that and keep reminding myself that it wasn't necessarily because we were the best band at the time. It was just pure, dumb luck. Dead Kennedys continued to play wherever it could, insisting on underage's shows and DIY booking themselves. As Michael Azarad would later point out in Our Band Could Be Your Life, it was Canada's DOA and the DKs who became the Lewis and Clarks of the punk touring circuit, blazing a trail across America that bands still follow today. Or as Black Flag's Greg Ginn put it in the same book, with those bands we did a lot of networking, sharing information. We'd find a new place to play, then we'd let them know because they were interested in going wherever they could and playing. Then we would help each other in our own towns. Hence Black Flag would support Dead Kennedys at the Mabuhay Gardens on 10 October 1979, a gig that Joe Nolt of The Last would record in his journal. The only thing I knew about the Dead Kennedys was that their singer, Jello Biafra, was running for mayor. The other 3 members of the band came on stage looking about as menacing as the crickets. Then Jello bounced out and pandemonium ensued. Those fuckers were great, one of the best hardcore bands I've seen in a while. Jello would antagonize and fall into the crowd a la Darby Crash of the Germs, except that, unlike Darby, he never lost control, never stopped singing, controlled chaos. 7 California Uber Alles / Man with the Dogs US. Released 1979, first plus second pressing, alternative tentacles / optional music, single review plus gig listing, /magazine vol. 2 No. 9 October 1979, California Uber Alles / Man with the Dogs UK, released 1979, fast product, poster designed by Jamie Reed to promote California Uber Alles. Though the imagery mixes triumph of the will with a reminder of Altamont thuggery, Reed actually used a photograph from the Reading Festival. The design of this poster also coincided with Reed's work for the Sex Pistols film The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, as evidenced in the cannabis swastikas, and Never Trust a Hippie footnote. DK's Live Victory, 1978. Photograph by Ruby Ray, DK's Live Defeat, 1978. Biafra was regularly pantsed after that. Photograph by Ruby Ray. It's important to remember that the DK's stature would have much to do with their overseas reception. In an age when many American critics had Anglophile tendencies, it meant that the DKs had an international gravitas that peers such as DOA, Black Flag, and Minor Threat could not initially match. The buzz around the band in the UK that followed the release of California Uber Alles was therefore welcome. However, there was some degree of consternation at the emergence of a highly politicized punk band from sunny California at a time when opinion formers had concluded that punk's slide was terminal, though that was never Biafra's view. There was a whole other generation rumbling right beneath the surface that exploded the very next year. Everybody from the crass label bands to Discharge to the Riot City bands and the others, they were right below the surface. But the British music press wasn't interested and wasn't paying attention to it. There was good reason for that. Some of the releases on Crass were extraordinary and Discharge did indeed up the ante. Much of the rest was mush. Coincidentally, Dead Kennedys would secure a high-profile show supporting punk warhorses, The Clash at Kesar Pavilion, on 13 October 1979. That was a very big show for us, remembers Ray, and we were in the hallway looking at the private dressing room. It was one of the few shows that Biafra lost his pants, which gave us no end of notoriety. But very scary for him, I would imagine. It wasn't planned or part of the act. Promoter Bill Graham was so outraged by Jello's nudity, he vowed that the Dead Kennedys would never appear on one of his stages again, and was as good as his word. I jumped into the crowd and came back with only my belt, my boots, and my Argyle socks intact, Biafra recalls. So I did the rest of the show nude. From what I was told afterwards, Bill Graham had to be physically restrained from going on stage and beating the crap out of me. But Bill Graham didn't ban us. We just refused to work for him. It was the last time we ever played for him. Boy, am I glad of that. I know he has a good reputation in some circles, but certainly not underground punk circles at the time. He was very heavy-handed and had monopolistic practices, whereby any show that wasn't Bill Graham wasn't supposed to exist in the San Francisco Bay Area. A rumor went round that he destroyed an entire print run of the First Nuns record when he heard Decadent Jew, without realizing that it was written by Jewish band member Jeff Olina, and was intended to debunk stereotypes. Biafra disputes the potential of this happening. But when there was money to be made, Biafra concludes, of course he came round and booked Husker Du. Even the Screamers got booked once by Bill Graham. As for seeing the Clash up front, Biafra was unmoved. I'd seen them before, Biafra recalls. I can't remember if I really watched much of them the night we played with them. We'd sort of got a bad taste in our mouths because they took a 4-hour sound check, showing they were men of the people by giving little kids the guitars to play Louie Louie, while the Cramps and Dead Kennedys and Rockabilly Rebels waited for a sound check that was never allowed. Then they went back to the hotel and only came back right before they went on stage. It was not really a pivotal moment in the history of Dead Kennedys. Climbing the Amps, 1978. Jello Biafra and Joe Reese of Target in front. Photographed by Ruby Ray, DK's Live Crazy Dance, 1978. Biafra had some crazy moves that the audience would imitate. Photograph by Ruby Ray. Chapter 4. Are You Believin' the Morning Papers? Driving to pick up his son, Benny alternated between the Sleepers and the Dead Kennedys, San Francisco bands he'd grown up with. From Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, featuring a chapter on the Fab Mab, which won the 2011 Pulitzer Prize, Biafra was by now, clothed or otherwise, already the consummate frontman. I come from a theater background. I like moods. I like vibe. I like characters. I didn't realize for years how much the method acting I went through influenced both the music and lyrics I write, and how I match them up. When it comes to production and mixing, I'm more like a film director, more interested in vibe or mood than each instrument being perfect. The lyrics are very visual. Often, you are their scenario, instead of ranting and raving about a particular subject I have opinions on. Back home in Boulder, in a delectable piece of casting, he'd previously appeared as the lead Nazi in a high school production of The Sound of Music, as well as playing the Boris Karloff role in Arsenic and Old Lace. Some of my best moments on stage are when the characters do come to life from inside me, and I can see parts of where the character is at in my mind's eyes. It also gave Dead Kennedys an immediate visual signature. I realized early on that I should bring out parts of myself that I didn't see in the main visionaries of other bands, he continues. There were voids I could fill. I was more theatrical on stage than any other singer I knew of in San Francisco. I saw a distinct lack of that and tried to fill that hole, but at the same time get some Stooges and Germs energy into the mix as well. I still do that. It's the same thing I do today. Similarly, he was keen to mark out lyrical turf away from his peers. I try to write songs about things other people haven't already written about. Granted, the Circle Jerks and the Washington, D.C. Youth Brigade came out with songs about the moral majority at the same time I wrote mine, but in the long run, I knew mine was going to be the most cruel. The theatrics went hand in hand with a lifelong devotion to troublemaking. Never as po-faced as some critics maintain, Biafra always enjoyed a mischievous wheeze, for more on which you are directed to his interview in re/search publications pranks. Compendium. However, it was his mayoral challenge, in the fall of 1979, that won him most notoriety. A benefit for his campaign was held on Labor Day in early September. The symptoms, antibodies, eye protection, contractions, and pink section were among the support bands, which together with a spaghetti banquet raised a budget of $1,500. The Mabuhay was synonymous with cheap spagball, as nutritious a meal as many local punks could afford, as well as late-night music, so it all seemed appropriate. Most of the budget went on buying a place on the ballot. If a person doesn't get enough petition signatures to run for local office in San Francisco, says Biafra, they can make up the difference by paying something like $10 a head. The manifesto was written on a napkin while watching a Peer Ubu concert after Ted had ribbed him about having such a big mouth he should stand for electoral office. His policies had several strands, including hiring laid-off city workers as panhandlers at 50% commission to replace funds lost through the deeply unpopular Proposition 13 tax dodge. This particularly irksome slice of legislature appeased property owners while ballooning the state's budget deficit by fixing the maximum tax take to 1% of any property's cash value assessed at 1975 values. It is actually popular to the point of being sacred now, Biafra updates us. Thus the state is bankrupt. Police would have to stand at elections, and squatting would be legalized in disused buildings. A board of bribery would be established to set influence rates. Most enterprising of all Biafra's manifesto commitments, downtown businessmen would have to dress as clowns between the hours of 9 to 5. Despite this, Biafra's manifesto was supported by the most unlikely of sources. But then Sheriff Mike Hennessy was a huge fan of punk rock and a regular at the Fab Mab. Only in San Francisco, there's always room for Jell-O was one of the campaign catchphrases, parodying an actual 1964 advertising strapline used by Jell-O's manufacturers, Kraft, as well as Apocalypse Now, Vote for Biafra, and the simple but emphatic What if he wins. Other coups included vacuuming leaves from the front lawn of opponent Dianne Feinstein's lawn, debunking her publicity stunt of sweeping Frisco streets. I did it because ever since I was about 6 or 7, Biafra related, I discovered I had a peculiar talent for annoying people, and I got more and more interested in perfecting ways to do it over the years. The headliners for a second benefit show were British band The Members, who were on their first tour of America. We were playing a gig through the FBI booking agency run by Ian Copeland at the Waldorf Ballroom, remembers vocalist Nikki Tesco. We turned up to play, and Jell-O was down the front going bananas. We'd heard of Dead Kennedys, and he came backstage, and boy, can he talk. I really liked Jell-O. The times I spent in San Francisco hanging out with him were brilliant. Jell-O wanted to do a fundraiser, so he asked us if we were up for it. That was at a place in Geary Street, a desanctified synagogue, the temple, where a lot of punk events took place. We said, yeah, let's do it. It was probably the best gig we did on that tour because it wasn't a bar or club. Younger people were able to get in, and it raised quite a lot of money. That night, Jell-O and I went out drinking, and that was a blast. He took me to this place where there was a long, narrow bar, and I wasn't really paying attention, and I'm not at all homophobic, but I must have clocked that I was in a gay bar. I looked behind the bar and saw a middle-aged woman in a Dior dress, and she had a beard. Jell-O was always very focused. It was quite difficult times. America wasn't London. America has a lot of crazies walking round, but Jell-O would really speak his mind. All the crazies in America head west, and when they reach California, they can't go any further. And if you read the things he said, Jell-O was very prescient and very articulate. A lot of his lyrics were highly intelligent. I remember him being funny and sharp. Still to this day, me and my kids play Cambodia and California Uber Alles. The upshot was that Jell-O came fourth of 10 candidates in the November poll with 79% of the vote, and more than 500 votes. Feinstein's campaign manager was heard to bemoan the fact that if someone like that could achieve such a turnout, this city is in real trouble. Feinstein held office for 10 years before becoming a Democratic senator. In a strange twist of DKS-related trivia, she officiated at Jerry Brown's 2005 wedding and was all set to run against him until pulling out of the race for governor in February 2010. More importantly, Biafra's candidature proved a focal point for the San Francisco underground and punk community. Damaged fanzine editor Lapwood Crow. We have our own paper, our own television station Target, and our own candidate for mayor. Whether directly related or not, a welter of new bands formed and found themselves with new venues to play beyond the Fab Mab. X's, the Hotel Utah, Rock City, the Back Door, etc. There was a symbiotic resurgence in local performance and visual media hosted at art clubs such as the A-Hole and Club Generic. All of these developments may well have occurred without the mayoral campaign or dead Kennedys, but it didn't hurt. However, despite the notoriety of the campaign and the immediate success of California über alles, Biafra maintains that at this time, dead Kennedys were only just moving ahead of the Dills and Mutants in local popularity. My memory of Jello Biafra as a performer is that he interacted with the audience more than a lot of punk singers, notes author Jennifer Egan, who watched the band at several Fab Mab shows and elsewhere. He'd leap into the audience and get passed around for quite a while before returning to stage. I seem to recall his pants being torn off on at least one of these occasions, an exciting thing for a high school girl to witness. I was at that supporting the Clash at Kezar's show. My sense is that Jello was less troubled than a lot of the punk singers. He had energy and vitality, a kind of playfulness that was very different from, say, Ricky Sleeper. Jello didn't seem genuinely angry or depressed. I have no idea what his drug use was like, but I'm guessing he wasn't a junkie. The fact that he ran for mayor of San Francisco also suggested a broader vision than a lot of punk singers seem to have. The success of California über alles also earned the group an appearance at San Francisco's BAMI Awards on 25 March 1980. Bay Area musician, or BAM for short, was kind of the Rolling Stone for San Francisco, Ray recalls. It would have these award shows every year. You get to give an award to people, and that strokes their ego. That's what the BAMIs were about. As a journalist, one of your biggest fears is being uncool. And the BAMIs figured they were being uncool because the Clash were coming. All this stuff was coming out in England, all this new music in the top 10. And there's nothing like that in the States. So they asked us to play, in order to give themselves some street cred, I guess. And of course we were meant to play our big hit, California über alles. But we changed it a bit, and it became Pull My Strings. Dead Kennedys took the stage at the Warfield Theater in new wave attire, comprising white shirts emblazoned with a large S. During the intro to their hit single, Biafra took the microphone. Hold it. We've got to prove we're adults now. We're not a punk band, we're a new wave band. The differentiation in genre affiliation not explicit in Ray's original band advert is important to note. The American incarnation of new wave was regarded as a dilution, a way for the biz to continue selling records with a decorative coating of fake edge. The BAMIs acknowledged new wave because of the runaway success of the Knack, Biafra elaborates. The latter's insipid new wave was widely derided within the punk community as a paradigm of this hybrid, right through to a jokey Nuke the Knack campaign. Thin black ties were then draped over the band's shirts to form a $sign, the parody completed by the opening chords to My Sharona, rechristened My Payola. Biafra goaded the bemused audience to sing along. Ray played a fine hand too, regurgitating a thoroughly loathsome guitar solo, Hendrix style, teeth and all, while his compatriots stood around yawning. Pull My Strings is also the only song where Ted wrote the music, Biafra adds. I think I did give him the lyrics ahead of time. We needed a new wave song, so I turned to the guy in the band who most wanted us to be more pop. And he really came through. Among the audience members to witness these surreal events, later voted the 26th greatest rock moment of all time in the NME, were Carlos Santana, Jerry Garcia, Ronnie Montrose, Francis Ford Coppola, Eddie Money, Boz Scaggs, and Journey. That was a different world we hated so much we didn't want anything to do with it, notes Biafra, who maintains that the stunt was his idea and the rest of the band were resistant to it, but had fun with it in the end. Scaggs was particularly outraged, and Coppola allegedly shoved Ted into a wall as he passed him backstage, though both Money and Journey drummer Steve Smith saw the funny side and congratulated Biafra on the evening's antics afterwards. The live recording of Pull My Strings was another early period Dead Kennedys recording to see release on the posthumous compilation Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death. It had provisionally been intended to combine it as part of a live 4-song 12-inch with the Erg. A music war/M movie versions of Chemical Warfare, Government Flu and Bleed For Me, which were filmed in August 1980 but ended up missing the soundtrack cut, though the latter track was appended to the 2009 DVD release on Warner's. The film, produced by Miles Copeland, has stunning footage, if you can forgive the poorly synchronized crowd shots. And it's interesting to note the lyrics to Bleed For Me attacking Rosalind Carter, the then First Lady. Ronald Reagan, aka Cowboy Ronnie, would be the subject of the released version, but he was then only a month on from securing the Republican nomination evidence. Once again, that Biafra liked to keep his words contemporaneous. Portion of a collage by Winston Smith from Fuckfacts #1, a newspaper of collage art included with the Dead Kennedys album Bedtime for Democracy img alt equals im. Age src equals images /71-1. JPG East Bay Ray, 1978. Photograph by Ruby Ray, DK's Live, on the Floor 1978. Photograph by Ruby Ray, Dead Kennedys at the Bahamas. Illustration by Vasilia Dimitrova, Dead Kennedys hard rock comic, originally published by Revolutionary Comics. Words by Dina Dassine, artwork by Joe Paradise, stuff by J. Allen Sanford. Portions of the collage poster given away with fresh fruit for rotting vegetables / M. Designed by Jello Biafra. Biafra for Mayor, 1978. Campaign poster. Photograph by Ruby Ray. Chapter 5. Anyone can be king for a day. Seek not the favor of the multitude. It is seldom got by honest and lawful means. But seek the testimony of few, and number not voices, but weigh them. Immanuel Kant, M. Adders were moving quickly in the UK. Bill Gilliam called and said, "Do you guys want to tour England?" Ray recalls. "We said, sure." Then he called back and said, "It's hard to tour on a single. Have you got enough stuff for an LP?" "Sure." Then he put Ian McNay, Cherry Red co-founder, in touch with me, and we worked it out from there. Gilliam had originally discovered the band via 3 tracks, Police Truck, Short Songs, and Straight A's on the Live at the Def Club compilation, recorded in October 1979. 8. He takes up the story. "I used to be a booking agent for people like Sham 69. And while I was doing Sham 69, I was sniffing round this band from the States with this silly name. I just thought it would be fun to get them over here. Eventually, I got them the deal with Cherry Red. Before that, I got thrown out of just about every record company without them even hearing the tapes." Gilliam would eventually head up the UK division of the band's Alternative Tentacles label. That wasn't the only interest in the UK, nor the only Sham 69 connection. Tony Gordon, their manager, and later behind the success of Culture Club et al., was also pursuing us after he saw us open for Sham 69 at the Whiskey in LA, Biafra recalls. "He was blown away. He was proposing we come to the UK and tour with Sham and record the album live at the Marquee, to be released on Safari, a small independent label set up by Deep Purple's former management team, whose key act would be Toya. Can you imagine what a disaster that would have been? At the height of Sham's hooligan problem, we didn't know any better. Luckily, we chose Cherry Red because they were the only ones offering a full studio album. Ian McNay first met Gilliam through Chris Gilbert, manager of the Hollywood Brats and Gilliam's partner in a booking and management agency in Westbourne Grove. Gilbert called McNay to say Gilliam was working with a band called Dead Kennedys. I was obviously aware of the band, McNay recalls, because they had California Uber Alles out through Fast Product, and I'd heard that and really liked it. Gilliam explained that the band had asked for $10,000 to do an album. Biafra believes it was $8,000. I said I'm definitely interested and went off to think about it. I got to hear a demo of the original version of Holiday in Cambodia, which I wish I'd kept. I heard that and thought that's great. I just knew the album would do so well. I didn't have the $10,000 at that stage because Cherry Red was in a formative stage. So I was wondering how I was going to get this $10,000, but I didn't tell Bill that. My only other reservation was, I liked the name Dead Kennedys because it was controversial, but I wondered whether that was going to block me too much for radio play or anything else. He got over that. I mused and decided I was fine with the name, and I'd get beyond that okay, McNay continues. I had a close relationship in those days with Caroline Records, a Virgin-owned export company. I was having lunch one day with the buyer, Richard Bishop, and chatting about my dilemma that I had an opportunity with Dead Kennedys, but I didn't have the money to pay them what they wanted. Richard said, maybe there's a deal where we give you the money, and you give us a good price on export, and a 3-month exclusive, which means during that time you wouldn't sell to any other exporter. I thought, that's not a bad idea. So we ended up doing the deal, and Caroline gave me the $10,000. McNay, as anyone with experience of working with him will attest, is not one to bet the farm on a single artist, and not for the first or last time he'd successfully spread the risk of his involvement with a project. The investment would become the defining moment in the label's early history prior to its Pillows and Prayers era, when Mike Alway took over its A&R, and set the foundations for what remains one of the most successful long-standing UK independent labels. When I was in America, remembers McNay, I saw them play a college date about an hour and a half hours drive from San Francisco. I remember the whole thing being very raw and shambolic. The sound was very, very raw. The whole evening was shambolic. But that was punk and that was Dead Kennedys. The tour in the UK all went fine. It's not as if they had the problems that the Sex Pistols had or anything. The dates happened, there was a good turnout, and a minimum of trouble from what I remember. In the meantime, the band busied themselves with a second single and managed to outdo themselves. Holiday in Cambodia crystallizes so much of what Dead Kennedys were about. At its heart lay Olympic-standard sarcasm at the complacency of Middle America and its me generation, tracing a direct line through to the inequity of its foreign policy. But the constructs are defiantly non-linear. Elementary school perennial Dr. Seuss story, the Sneetches is invoked in reference to star-bellied Sneetches and invidious hierarchies, and the merry-go-round of envy and conformity. And I figured Sneetch also rhymed with leech, Biafra concedes generously. The music conveys a congruent sense of jeopardy and revulsion. Klaus's chilling bass hum sets the stage for Ray's guitar, dropping in and out of the rhythm before ripping away on a series of tack-sharp leads. That sense of heightened menace is attributed by Ray to the use of a flatted fifth, achieved by playing a dissonant fifth note half an octave removed in a chord sequence. It is a technique common to both bebop jazz and hard rock, but also known as the devil's interval, diabolus in musica. Medieval musicians were hanged for using it. Priests believed it destroyed the fabric or consonants of the perfect octave. The song's conclusion is fevered, the whole piece flawlessly arranged. I didn't realize it at the time, says Klaus, but that bass section, it was two different things basically. There was the Velvet Underground thing of having the droned A string, like in Venus in Furs. It's got this constant drone going on in it. It was that feel and also Led Zeppelin. I just realized what I'd done subconsciously was speed up that Zeppelin riff and throw it against a drone. Nothing in music is completely original unless you go into John Cage land. I was just taking the roots and mutating them. That was one of the few times the band put together a song as a unit, confirms Biafra, and it wasn't just one member bringing in the whole song, and that's probably why it's so good. I brought in an original Holiday in Cambodia that was more of a Ramon-style chainsaw punk song. Ray and Klaus said they didn't like it and didn't want to play it, and I was very hurt and very upset this had never happened before. Then Klaus started playing that bass line the same day while I'd stepped out of the garage. And I ran back and said, wait a minute, slow down, Holiday in Cambodia, take away my verse riff, put that one in, and use the original pre-chorus, chorus, and the bridge, and this could be a really cool song. And sure enough it was. Ray couldn't come up with a part. I kept saying, Ray, think Syd Barrett. Then finally Ray found that guitar part that he has over Klaus's bass at the beginning of the verses, and Holiday in Cambodia, as we know it, was born. The inspiration for the lyrics to Holiday in Cambodia may surprise somewhat. I wrote it in Boulder before I moved to San Francisco, states Biafra. It was basically a reaction against me delivering pizzas to really spoiled, drunk college students at the University of Colorado for a year and a half. I thought that would be a good thing to do to them. It's the same clowns who inspired Terminal Preppy on plastic surgery disasters, as well, if you want to call it inspiration. They're the people I wrote both songs about. Jezza X, aka Jezza Jedian, either as producer or engineer, shaped the early Californian punk sound through releases by The Germs, Avengers, Black Flag, and X, as well as playing with the Bags and Deadbeats. I would have been in my late 20s, I guess, he recalls. In some cases, 5 to 10 years older than everyone else. I already had some street chops. I was a radical in the 60s, doing draft counseling when I was 14 and an underground newspaper at my high school. I already had a lot of ideas on how to mobilize people. When punk rock came up, I threw my heart into that. I was always interested in recording, but I hadn't done very much. I was roommates with Joe Nannini and Stan Ridgway of Wall of Voodoo before punk. We were playing at various clubs and cafes, and it was just ridiculous. You could not turn up an amplifier, or everyone would freak out. So we were hungry for loud music. Joe came in one day with a Ramones record. We just listened to it all the way through and flipped out. Then the same thing happened pretty soon after that with the Sex Pistols record. Anyway, I listened to the Ramones, and I saw it right away. Then Joe and I were immediately trying to get into a punk rock band. We went and saw some bands, the Weirdos, the Screamers, and were just genuinely thrilled. The Germs were also around already. I spoke to Brendan Mullen, founder of famed LA punk venue The Mask, and asked if I could rent a small space there. I became the sound man and Brendan's right-hand person. I did the Germs, my band's The Deadbeats, and the Bags on Danger House Records, and those went far and wide in California. A lot of bands wanted to talk to me after that. I was also a lot of people's house engineer, going up and down the coast, going to San Francisco and mixing bands at Mabuhay Gardens and other places. And that's also how people got to know me. When they saw the record's word just got around. The whole punk contingent was relatively small. They were all into the same records, the 45s that came from England or New York or LA. His link to Dead Kennedys came almost out of nowhere, but was tangentially connected to Biafra's then favorites, the Screamers. I was the Screamers' kind of roadie and soundman, and I went everywhere the Screamers went. We went frequently to San Francisco. Target Video began to video these bands. Target, founded by Joe Reese, quickly established itself at the heart of the Californian underground, its black building home to 3 floors whose editing, recording and video studios, and punk rock jukebox made it a natural clubhouse for the emergent San Francisco punk scene. They loved the Screamers, Jezza explains, because that was the #1 art band. We'd go with the Screamers to do a live video shoot, and I'd mix the sound, and those things turned out pretty nice, most of them. We were doing one of these video shoots and got invited to lunch by these kids, who I thought had just graduated school. Biafra believes this to be he and Carlos. They told us this crazy pipe dream that they had of a band they were going to start called Dead Kennedys. I thought, wow, that's a pretty good name. They were going to just rage at you. They were all enthusiasm. I made a mental note of the name, and I got a chance to go back maybe a month or 2 later. And who was headlining the Mabuhay but Dead Kennedys? So I had to see them. I was standing right in front of the PA monitors. I'll never forget this, and Dead Kennedys come on and play Holiday in Cambodia. I'm getting chills right now, I don't know how many years later, talking about it. My hair just stood on end. I was hearing this song come off the stage, and watching Biafra, this amazing front person. I thought, my God, this song's a hit. This is unbelievable. These guys are great. I was laughing. I couldn't believe that these kids who came up with this wild idea, this crazy fantasy, could have been one of the best bands I had seen on the West Coast ever. They were so good already. They were phenomenal. I would have been a nut not to cut that song. I got a phone call a few weeks later, unsolicited. It was the Dead Kennedys. They had got some money together. They were going to record their second single, Holiday in Cambodia. Would I like to do it? Heck yeah, would I like to do it. That's how that went down. It was probably Biafra, because he and I by that time had something of a rapport. After that set, I'm sure I went up to them and drooled, told them how great they were. That's always how it is if I fall in love with a band or a song. Maybe the sincerity of that wins bands over, I dunno. It was very difficult to find a recording engineer who was willing to throw away their 70s studio training, reflects Biafra, and the whole 70s studio mentality, that everything needed to sound clean, muffled, and mellow. Otherwise, you'll never get to record the next Eagles, or ELO. A lot of the people who made the early punk singles were learning how to record that kind of loud, fiery music by trial and error. A few, like Jezza X, were applying what they learned from the straight studio world to make a fuller, nastier-sounding punk single than some of their peers. But a lot of the engineers actually fought the bands over the sound the bands wanted, which makes it all the more ironic that some of the cartoon retro bands of the last 10 years have set their guitars and amps in order to sound like badly recorded late 70s punk singles that weren't supposed to sound that way in the first place. It was crazy, Jezza notes of the sessions. It was Tewksbury Studio in Richmond in the East Bay, where we did Holiday in Cambodia. As with all other punk rock records, this was a semi-decent studio, but it had some major equipment problems. What they had that was amazing, the guy who owned it, Dan Alexander, was kind of a fetishist for these antique tube microphones. They are the bomb, better than any other microphones at the time, and revered to this day. Many of them come from immediately post-World War II. I was less acquainted with tube mics, but I had repaired one in my artist recording studio where Jezza had originally set up operations, close to the Mask days. He was pulling them out in these drawers, lined with red velvet. I was going, my God, these are like sex toys. He brought out all these microphones, including a particularly good-sounding vintage Neumann U47, used extensively by George Martin in recording the Beatles. So we got this U-47 out. I was saying Biafra has a big manly voice. We want to get the fullness of that sound. The microphones also had an impact on the record's overall acoustics. We got 2 mics out, Jezza continues. We used one of them, a huge lollipop-like antique Sony, for the womb microphone on the giant reverberated echo-chambered guitar. I like it dry, but there was something about his Ray's guitar that needed a little extra something. I tight-mic'd it so it didn't get too much of the echo, then I got the far mic with this lollipop Sony. That was an experiment. I didn't know what that mic was going to sound like. And it sounded great on the womb mic of his amp. Then we also, I believe, had a couple of mics on the Tom-Toms, deluxe mics. Now in the control room, there was this big old Ampex MM1000 tape machine. If you've ever seen one, it looks like an industrial refrigerator up to the roof. And every channel you have to use lever switches on the actual channel. There's no remote to handle all that stuff. It's like an antique. It's a good sounding machine. If you could get one that works, it would still be a good sounding machine. So I learned how to use all that part of it, but the brakes weren't working. So for the entire record, I was stopping the tape with my bare hands. If I would press stop, it would just go flying. I had to shuttle between rewind and fast forward until I could slow it down enough so I could stop it and grab it with my hands. That entire song could have just melted in the take. That's what's so funny about the whole thing. Because if the tape stretches, you're screwed. I got burns on my hands from doing that. Watching the band in situ in the studio was as awe-inspiring as the Mabuhay performance. Biafra was a crazy artist, Jezza continues. He had some practical real-world chops, but not like Ray. Ray was a real studious person. But when it came down to the studio stuff, Biafra had all of his lyric charts for both of us. He had everything underlined and circled where it needed to go. He was always there at the board helping me switch stuff in and out when I needed to do finger moves. There was no automation. There were several of us switching things on and off. There might have been several of us at the board when we mixed it, because it was too hard to do all the moves at once. Another distinctive element of the sound on the single version of Holiday in Cambodia was the percussion. There's this crazy thing about the snare drum, notes Jezza. I tried to put some padding on the snare like I normally do, but Ted had this unique head on it that I've never seen before. It looked like fiberglass, the kind you'd use on a surfboard. It was like a mesh. Anything I put on it was messing up the sound, so I think we just left it live. But that snare was some crazy cool thing because of the snare hat. It had a ping. I wasn't the best engineer, yet I was still fiddling around. We didn't have a lot of time to try things over and over, so some of it was this sounds good on this. That sounds good on that. We'd adjust it and modify it a bit, but there was a certain amount of luck that the record turned out sounding so good. A lot of it was Biafra's patience with me. I wanted to do stuff, and he helped make that happen. And also his patience with all of the doubling. When we came to the original mix, we were switching stuff in and out on portions of the chorus. Biafra and I drew up a chart of where we doubled and quadrupled everything, then switched it in and out on the mix. I used 2 production masters. He continues, I didn't just record the band. The stuff that was really hidden, there was the doubling on all the guitars in some places in the chorus, the guitars were quadrupled, and the vocals on the chorus were also doubled or quadrupled. But it was punk rock, all those elements needed to be hidden, but that's one of the reasons it sounded so big. I had already learned a lot about those tricks. Ray, even though he had an Echoplex and all this other reverb, I took his guitar amplifier into an echo chamber, and I mic'd it close and far. So not only was it all his reverb and echo stuff, there was also a room echo that he was flatly insisting would not work, and it turned out to sound just incredible on the guitar. I want to put on the record, too, that I really respected Ray. He's a doll. He's always done such a good job on the business side. Jezza maintains that of all those epochal records he produced in the late 70s, Dead Kennedys are the only band who have paid him. I'm totally straight with him. He was always such a good business cat right from the beginning. He was the reason all of their stuff worked the way it did. He's a really competent person, an awesome guitar player. With me, he's always been really laid back and good-natured. Actually, I take that back a little bit. There was some conflict during the recording days. He did want to be a producer, and there was tension between Ray and me, and not Biafra and me. Biafra was going along with all of my ideas, and Ray was kind of fighting them. So Biafra indulged me a little bit more than Ray did at the time. We were all still learning and experimenting. Afterwards, my relationship with Ray became very good-natured, 'cause I saw what he was about and really respected him for it. Biafra was always a sort of bellicose and pompous person, and that was the beauty of his personality on stage and in interviews and everything. The single endorsed and even enshrined Jezza's growing reputation as sonic chronicler of West Coast punk. It's funny, at the time the Dead Kennedys were so well known, and I got so much promotion value out of Holiday in Cambodia. Still to this day, everyone knows I did that. I only did parts of the other records where they would have one person recording the music tracks, probably because Ray preferred it. That was Tom Wilson, producer of Plastic Surgery Disasters, who was doing some great records at the time. No complaints there. Then having me do the vocals with Biafra, which is a big job but a very fun job. An intense guy, but he didn't like working with anyone but me. We had a really good bond there. For Ted's part, he again prefers the single version every time. I always liked Holiday in Cambodia, but not the version so much that's on Fresh Fruit. Jello agrees. The single version sends more chills down my spine. Some of that was the Jezza X Factor too. Ray is not convinced. It's interesting that Biafra and Ted both loved the singles more. And those were the ones that I mixed. Biafra disputes Ray's right to take overarching credit for either single's mix. I actually mixed them, the two sides of the single, Holiday in Cambodia and Police Truck, by myself. Nobody was there. What happened was that Jezza was mixing them, and nobody liked them, and then I said, let me go mix them. I brought them back, and the band chose two of those over the Jezza ones. But I don't want to cut down Jezza. I wanted the sound to be in front of the speakers rather than behind the speakers. I wanted it to sound like the band was in the room with you. Yes, confirms Jezza, Ray mixed it. I did a mix, and when they played it in other rooms, it didn't have enough bass in it, so he went back and remixed it himself. That's fine. I recall that the first mix did not have enough bass in it. And he was right. When we went and checked it out, it did not have enough bass. In those days, that was a chronic mix problem of mine, so that wouldn't have been an exaggeration. It does seem to me that he went and mixed it himself after that, 'cause I don't recall going back and doing anything like that. And I do vaguely recall being okay with it, because it sounded like it was supposed to. He kept it exactly the way it sounded. Holiday in Cambodia saw 3,000 copies pressed in America on Optional, who had picked up the rights to its predecessor, before it was re-released on Faulty Products. The indie distribution arm of IRS, run by Miles Copeland, Faulty was formed when A&M's Jerry Moss, a yachting buddy of Ted Kennedy, refused to distribute material by the band because of their name. In the UK, it would bear the cherry red imprint on release in May 1980. The same agreements would eventually extend to the release of the band's debut album, too, although, significantly, the US release followed its UK counterpart by 4 months in January 1981. If there has ever been a more fully formed, exhilarating punk single than Holiday in Cambodia, your correspondent has yet to hear it. If the other guys had pushed as hard as I did, laments Biafra, and we kept coming up with band-written songs like Holiday in Cambodia, instead of me writing most of the music, how good a band would we have been? We were a pretty good band, but we could have been an even better band. Slip and Slide Jello 1978. Jello Biafra at the Mabuhay. Photographed by Ruby Ray, Jello Swim 1978. On floor of the grimy Mabuhay stage. Photographed by Ruby Ray, Holiday in Cambodia / Police Truck. KUS release 1980. Optional music / Faulty Products. Holiday in Cambodia / Police Truck, UK release 1980 first plus second pressing. Cherry Red, Holiday in Cambodia / Police Truck label. Italian release 1981, Ariston. Class equals image caption lyric insert US release 1980, optional music. Holiday in Cambodia / Police Truck label. French release 1980, Cherry Red, Holiday in Cambodia / Police Truck label. Australian release 1980 first pressing, missing link. Holiday I. In Cambodia / Police Truck, Australian release 1980 second pressing, missing link. Holiday in Cambodia / Police Truck jukebox card, insert portion of a collage by John Yates from the booklet included with the Dead Kennedys album Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death P class. Equals image 0 blur, 1978. Biafra was seldom still when on stage. Photograph by Ruby Ray. Chapter 6 Efficiency and Progress is ours once more music, in performance, is a type of sculpture. The air and the performance is sculpted into something. Frank Zappa, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, was recorded at Mobius Music in San Francisco. Ian and I both took a chance, reflects Bill Gilliam, by sending the money over to make the album to a San Francisco band who could have shoved it all up their nose. As it was, there was more danger that the drink/drug-free Biafra would have spent it on his ever-expanding record collection. They need not have worried. The sessions were disciplined and well-ordered. I suppose I'm quite trusting by nature, McNay says. I was confident it would all be okay. The band chose Oliver Di Sicco's studio in No Valley, which had just been converted to 16-track, and is affectionately recalled as a shoebox, with the band set up in one central, carpeted room with no isolation booths. The month-long sessions generally took place at night owing to Klaus's day job, with roughly a week each for basic tracks, overdubs, backing vocals, and keyboard and horn overdubs, and finally mixing. There was carpet on the floor, fiberglass panels on the walls with burlap on them, and then bare sheetrock. Di Sicco recalled to Heather Johnson in 2005. It was a small room and isolation was difficult to achieve. It was probably as bare bones of a recording as you could do. It wasn't fancy, but it was going to 2-inch 16-track, so there was plenty of tape real estate to put sound on. Tape hiss wasn't a problem because the sound never stopped. As Ted confirms, it was a very nice little studio in San Francisco. A very comfortable atmosphere. As Di Sicco intimates, the whole sound of the album can be attributed to a variety of enhancements, but just as crucially, restraints. His main difficulty was the wall of sound the band created, and his difficulty in distinguishing component elements as a result. Ray used a DoD overdrive preamp for the sessions, the Fender Super Reverb, and his trusty Echoplex and echo chamber, frequently employed in the '60s to produce UFO-type effects on sci-fi serials. He bought one after listening to Scotty Moore, using one on Mystery Train. Biafra had gravitated to using higher-quality Neumann U47 microphones at the suggestion of Jezza X to add luster to his vocals. Di Sicco overseeing the final mix on his Ampex 351 2-track. According to Di Sicco, nothing was fast enough or loud enough for Biafra, who would monitor the mixes in an upstairs lounge where a set of basic speakers gave him a chance to approximate how the recordings might actually sound on vinyl. Cherry Red gave us $10,000, Ray recalls, and I suggested to the band we use $6,000 and we get $1,000 each, because that's probably the last money we'd see. So we did it for $6,000. I'd been reading recording books and subscribed to the magazines back in the day, and they said the way to maximize your studio time is pre-production. And that's when you really know what you're going to do. It's all mapped out. You have this much time to do the basics, recording the bass and drums, then this much time for guitar overdubs, this much time for lead and background vocals, this much time for the fancy stuff like keyboards and horns, and then this much time for mixing. It was all planned out. People don't realize in music, you read about these musicians on MTV, and it all looks like fun and games. But 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. We were meticulous, confirms Biafra. We were never, and I have never been fast in the studio. California Uber Alles, just a goddamn single, took a month. But the results speak for themselves. The rest of the band would really get down on me for being too picky, or not looking at my watch, like Ray always did, perhaps because I didn't own one at the time. My feeling about this was, it wasn't just an attempt to document what we played at our live shows. I felt as a record collector and a fan, that these versions of the songs are the ones that everyone is going to hear 5, 10, 50 years from now. So as far as I was concerned, they damn well better be the best version of the song we ever played. That was the standard I tried to maintain. How many arguments it took. Biafra had wanted Jezza X to produce the album, based on how well Cambodia had turned out. The other guys shot that idea down, he says. So we realized we're going to have to do it ourselves and hope for the best. Ted recalls how the sessions panned out. Ray, Klaus, and I were in there first. We laid down 3 or 4 tracks for songs, and we thought they were pretty good tracks. And this was before Biafra showed up. Biafra came in and dismissed them all and said, "We've got to do them faster or something." We were a little put off by it, but I guess it turned out okay. There was probably a little time wasted, but overall it was pretty organized, the whole session. Most of the songs were so well rehearsed. We were playing so many shows at the time, and also rehearsing quite a bit. We had most of the stuff down before we ever got into the studio. There was some overdubbing, but the basic tracks were done in 1 or 2 takes. Increasing confidence drawn from their live shows meant they were pumped for the occasion. Yeah, it was exciting for me, Ted continues. California was the first time I'd been in a recording studio, so you had that out of the way, so to speak. You weren't so much in awe of being in a studio for the first time. It was kind of fun. Whether or not I knew what I wanted to do with the sound, I had an idea of what I wanted my own drums to sound like, but it was Ray and Biafra who did more of the production of it. There's several different takes of each of those songs as far as I remember, recalls Biafra. I wound up being the one that always chose which takes or mix to use. With Insight, we had a faster one that Ray thought was better, but I liked the one we actually used because I thought the song was more locked in and captured better. Insight wasn't included on the album itself, but was the one additional song recorded at the sessions and later became the B-side to the single version of Kill the Poor. Oliver had never worked on this type of music. Biafra continues. His main forte before us was people who became big new age musicians. One was Andy Narrell, another one was Alex Grassi. It's important because Oliver was so far in another field, yet he pulled this off. Unlike a lot of established engineers of the day, he was game to try to get the kind of sound we wanted. I would say he was mostly responsible, then Ray was with him in the console room. I was upstairs where there was another set of speakers. I would just stay out of earshot while Oliver tinkered with the various instruments. Then when he had a mix, he'd play it into those other speakers, and I'd make notes and come back in and decide what to do from there. I use that procedure to this day. I try to stay completely out of earshot of the engineer and let him do his job until he's got something worked up. Otherwise, I could bitch and moan about the snare drum for 6 hours. Then once I get a perfect snare drum, everything else would sound terrible. So I learned to stay away from that part of the process. To this day, I stay out of the room until the engineer thinks he's got something. Then I do the fine-tuning from there, or occasionally just rip it all down and try something else. It's fair to say Biafra and Ray don't see eye to eye on the production credits. On the record, the problem is that I didn't have enough control over the mix, states Ray. Biafra was coming in, sticking his nose in. I was looking back, thinking it would have been better if we'd kicked him out of the room and did the mixes and said, "Here." Biafra says Oliver oversaw the production. Actually, it was Oliver and me. I have all the EQ sheets. They're 90% my handwriting. I have the overdub sheets in my handwriting. I can prove it. The fact that Biafra has forgotten about it is not my problem. That was recorded on 16 tracks. So 16 channels, basically duplicates of each other, but one for the bass, the guitar, the voices, and different drums. You need to keep track of that on an intellectual level, where things are, how they're being routed and blended together. I didn't realize it at the time, but I'm good at song arranging, making it go someplace. You don't want to stay in one place too long, you want to keep the person's ears interested. Producer status was eventually given to Die Sicko's cat, Norm. Oliver had 2 cats, Norm and Motto, Biafra continues. But Norm was by far the friendlier. I hadn't been around a cat since I left home, so I was happy to have Norm's company and unwavering support. Even if he was sleeping in the middle of the mixing board when Oliver needed to get at some of the knobs. Obviously, Norm was the producer. To this day, I get inquiries from bands wondering if I can put them in touch with Norm so he can produce their album. But unfortunately, like Joe Meek before him, I'm afraid he's passed on. Fresh Fruit emphatically sustained the songwriting pedigree of both singles. None of the 14 tracks lacked a unique musical or lyrical hook. At times the humor is frantic and mischievous, stealing people's mail, the cover of Viva Las Vegas. At other times chilling and antagonistic, I Kill Children, Funland at the Beach, and Ill in the Head. Biafra's critics have targeted the last subset as being particularly sinister. But it was his customized shock therapy in his personal crusade for rejection of American moral platitudes. I wasn't sitting out and planning ahead of time to break this or that taboo, he says. I was just trying to say things that I thought needed to be said. Once I knew I could write songs and compose music and write lyrics, and realized that I was pretty good at it, there was no stopping me. So my standard has always been that every single one of my songs has to be something that I, the picky fan, would like to listen to, over and over again. I'd been through so many years of growing up on rock and roll and thinking that most of the lyrics were so stupid. That's partly what made punk such a breath of fresh air. The lyrics were volatile, topical. There was a real pressure to be intelligent, especially in San Francisco, and that applied to the music too. Everybody in DKs had this competitive edge, notes Ray. We want to write a better song than that band. We all had that in common. Fortunately, we had the talent to do so. Some people just have the ego, an ego with no talent. It seems impossible that anyone could eavesdrop, say, Funland at the beach, and its chorus of crushed little kids adorn the boardwalk, and not smirk at its glorious profanity. But they did. What I was trying to do with the music was try to make a Dead Kennedys song that had the fire of the Sonics, Biafra recalls. But what I had for lyrics at the time was a long, free-verse poem with much more detail in it, called Funland at the Beach. Then I had to chop it down to turn it into a Sonics-inspired punk rock song. Originally, when we were trying to mix that, it came out sounding kinda blurry, and the guitar was undefined. I can't remember which one of us came up with the idea, but it was suggested Ray add another track of guitar, where he played this low E-string, single-string twang like Duane Eddy. Then we kinda malted that down in the mix, where you can't really hear the Duane Eddy guitar, but the riff is much more clearly defined. But one lyric would win the moral outrage sweepstakes by several lengths. What I got most shit for over the years was I Kill Children, Biafra confirms. The premise of the song was, why does America have so many more mass murderers and serial killers than other countries? Supposedly, America has had more serial killers than all of the countries in the history of the world combined. Why? That's what the bridge of the song tries to answer. Ironically, the people who objected to that song most deeply were the religious right in the United States and the early British crasspunks. They thought it was too violent and too mindlessly blood-splattered. Then again, Alice Cooper is a part of my being too. I just tried to make the horror scenes something out of real life instead of vampires and monsters. Kill the Poor opened the album, anchored by peppy, across-the-beat drumming from Ted. One of the things that Ted did, recalls Klaus, he would change things up all the time. As much as we would speed up, he would like to change up the beat sometimes. That would sometimes throw Biafra a little bit. It became a sticking point between them. It was Ted's experimentation. Whereas Biafra in performance, he basically wanted to know where it was going. As a result of stuff like that, that's how Kill the Poor ended up being the disco thing on the Def Club album, for instance. Indeed, the version of the song from that March 1979 show, which took place at the eponymous underground club in the Mission District of San Francisco and was released retrospectively in 2004, has him doing just that, though it sounds more like jazz funk to these ears. Bruce aka Ted is a snap-tight drummer, continues Klaus. Kill the Poor the intro is a standard doo-wop progression, then it cuts into your standard Sex Pistols-type punk stuff, except faster. In fact, the song was originally intended as a pastiche of the Ramones' You're Gonna Kill That Girl. Quite a few people did spot the similarity in the chorus, on which Biafra's whooping enunciation of Tonight had more oscillations than a Dickie Nixon lie detector, but according to the singer were a nod to Buddy Holly. Kill the Poor, which mock-worshipped the neutron bomb, and its clean dispatch of what Scrooge once called the excess population, was an excellent example of Biafra's penchant for twists on standard punk rhetoric. Its restrained hysteria was reminiscent of Jonathan Swift's satirical A Modest Proposal for preventing the children of poor people in Ireland from being a burden to their parents or country, which proposed a leavening of economic blight by the destitute selling their children as food for the rich. It wasn't, on the surface, a protest song loaded with imperatives, the common denominator among punk bands addressing the topic. There's all kinds of anti-nuclear songs coming out, Biafra confirms, especially from older Californian hippie bands and British punk bands from a different perspective. So why not tap into my method, acting brain, and do a song coming from the military's point of view, or the Pentagon madmen's point of view? It will make it that much more evil. That was how Kill the Poor was born. Not everyone would prove fully conversant in Biafra's brand of sarcasm, however. At one Brooklyn gig, a girl, exploring the farthest reaches of literalism, rushed up to him in the dressing room exclaiming, "All right." Kill the Poor, Cherry Red's German licensee, did not include the lyric sheet with the album as a cost-cutting measure, and as a result, claims Biafra, some assumed it was an anthem for open season on Turks. I straightened that out from the stage right away. In fact, and for obvious reasons, it was California über alles that would create most problems in Germany. The band later hired, by coincidence rather than planning, a Turkish promoter for their Berlin shows in a move falsely portrayed as a scam by racist German newspapers. Kill the Poor had already caused a degree of more local difficulty. One of the reasons we had to move out of our garage, confirms Ray, apart from getting a drummer, the rehearsal that set the neighbors off to get the police was learning the song Kill the Poor. I think it was the repetition of kill, 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 kill that did it. The band's sound had stretched prior to the sessions. By the time the album was recorded, notes Klaus, there had been an organic thing, it germinated. We played around with all sorts of different permutations of how the songs could be in practice, going over and over the stuff. That's how the songs all became where they are. Someone would come in with an idea. Or between songs we'd jam on something, me and Ray, Bruce would kick in, and Biafra would put on the tape recorder and come back later with some lyrics to the section we'd played, and the song would grow out of that. It was very organic, and it took a while to come up with a 38-minute album. I don't think there was anything that was filler on that record. That was something that was cool about it. One of the things that is a source of that, Ray points out, was that the people in the band all listened to different kinds of music. We had punk rock in common, but Klaus had a big 78 RPM library of 30s jazz, and he also had the wacky Spike Jones comedy stuff. Biafra had a lot of garage rock stuff. 6025 was listening to more avant-garde stuff like Captain Beefheart. This is what makes a band great, to my mind, compared to a solo artist. You have different musicians who are talented, they bring in different viewpoints, and you mush them all together and come out with something new. That's kind of how rock and roll originated. Country, blues, gospel, jazz, a hybrid thing. A nice and common idea in theory, but rarely does it work so well in practice. Well, the basic thing is, states Ray, we rock out. In the New Yorker, there used to be a jazz critic, Whitney Balliet. He was a really, really good writer. Even if you didn't like the person he was talking about, you just read him for the writing. His bottom line was whether the jazz musicians swung or not. And it's like that with a rock and roll band, whether the energy is there. One of the most enjoyable aspects of Fresh Fruit is its readiness to defy listeners' expectations, delighting in finding a route out of a song just when you may have got a handle on the structure. People picked up on the humor in the lyrics immediately, but much of that wit is also embodied in the music. Yeah, confirms Ray, there's definitely musical jokes in there. It's not on the record, but recorded at a similar time, was Police Truck. Right before the solo starts, Klaus and I do the Batman theme. Police Truck is also a favorite with Ted, who believes the essence of the performances on the album was due to live groundwork. We played a lot live, so there's a certain energy when you play live. The hardest part with that, and a lot of bands have the same problem, is capturing that raw, live energy in a recording studio. Some days were better than others, just in terms of the times when we recorded, whether or not it was in the morning or later in the day. It's difficult to capture that live, raw feeling and excitement that you get on stage. There's an adrenaline rush you get when there's an audience there, participating. The type of music we were playing required some of that stimulant. I think we did the best we could at the time. According to Biafra, Police Truck was one of only 3 songs I wrote in 30 minutes or less all in one go. Nazi Punks Fuck Off and Voted Off the Island were the others. Ray added cool trademark guitar stuff later, so yes, he earned a co-writing credit. Let's Lynch the Landlord was partly inspired by Klaus and Biafra's experience of rented accommodation, although stories that did the rounds about the latter gaining revenge against the titular villain by rearing a colony of mice in the building's basement are entirely fictional, he states. Well, that's his own fault for advancing the idea in an interview with John Tobler at Zigzag, in which he related the tale of charging overdue plumbing repairs against his rent, and encountering a very large and surly gentleman knocking on his door as a result. It still has the same landlady, he says now. If she's still alive, she could sue us for slander. If you really want to expand on that, you can say that it appears to have had very few repairs to this day. The song proved to be the most difficult to pin down. Nobody was entirely sure why. Eventually, we all agreed that Bruce needed to recut his kick drum to Let's Lynch the Landlord and use something a little more simple. Biafra continues. You could almost see the steam coming out of his ears as he sat in the studio with nothing but his kick drum just tapping away. But it helped the song. Let's Lynch the Landlord was a song you should be able to dance to, and we couldn't figure out why it wasn't quite doing what it was supposed to. Then Oliver took me into the console room and said, "Listen to this kick drum. It's going to be a problem in the mix," so then we had Bruce redo it. Oliver realized pretty early on who was the most emotionally involved in the album, and he and I hit it off pretty well. chemical warfare reveled in a country club massacre fantasy. Cold War paranoia later ensured that the prospect of biological extermination become another favored topic within the punk canon. But no songs of similar title employed images of nerve gas rolling through golf greens and dry martinis crashing to the floor as the moneyed and complacent choked to death. None, to my certain knowledge, threw in a passable impression of an Oompa band either. The waltz, Biafra recalls. That came from my love of Sparks. I loved the wicked humor of Frank Zappa and the dry but really demented Sparks lyrics on Kimono My House, Propaganda, and especially Indiscreet. I suppose the Mail Brothers were a bigger influence on my own writing style than anyone else. In fact, the quote on the run-out groove of early pressings of the album, well, "Who are the Brain Police?" drew its provenance from a song by Zappa's Mothers of Invention. The choke scene featured the massed ranks of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal Choir, named after the infamous chemical weapons facility. "We just had a mass of people in there," Klaus remembers. "I'm not sure if we did it all in one take, or if Oliver had us do it 2 or 3 times through. We had a bunch of people there, some of them ended up being in Flipper. Indeed, Will Shatter, formerly of Negative Trend and latterly Flipper, was one contributor, alongside journalist and occasional Tubes lyricist Michael Snyder, the band's then manager Kai Kai, Dirk Dirksen, and Ninochka. The latter, Aka Therese Soder of punk band The Situations, would later marry Biafra. In a Graveyard. I put it to her former husband that the song neatly anticipates America's current fallacy or obsession with homeland security. You said it, I didn't. But the illusion of homeland security, the fallacy, whatever you want to call it, that's a good way of describing chemical warfare. It was written from the point of view of how easy it would be to break into the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado and steal nerve gas and drop it on a nearby golf course. Biafra continues. No other songs approach the subject of biological weapons that way. In a way, it's a current way of thinking about it. It wouldn't necessarily be a deranged prankster. It could be a very methodical Al-Qaeda-type terrorist. The Bush administration had all kinds of bells and whistles to terrify airline passengers and lock up people of Mideastern descent and put them in jail without trial. But our military weapons storage sites and nuclear power plants are largely unprotected, as are our shipping lanes. Hardly any of the cargo that comes off ships into our ports is ever inspected. You could just smuggle Osama bin Laden in one of those containers. You could smuggle in a big-ass surface-to-air missile. Osama could be driving in a cab in New York right now, and nobody would know. These comments were made, of course, prior to Obama's decisive action to eliminate the hirsute enemy of peace, democracy, and the American way. The Rocky Mountain Arsenal, meanwhile, has finally been cleaned up and designated a nature sanctuary, as well as Holiday in Cambodia, which in album form featured an extended intro that somehow managed to replicate the sound of human screaming. Ray employed his Echoplex on other songs like Drug Me and several solos, including Let's Lynch the Landlord. Improbably, his incredible sheet treble sound on the album was cultivated on ultra-low-budget equipment. I played a Japanese pawnshop Telecaster copy guitar, which I purchased for $100. I had added Seymour Duncan pickups, a humbucker at the bridge, and a Strat style for the neck, and a Schecter bridge. I still have it, and it definitely has a unique sound. Your Emotions, with a lyric by Ray, owed a direct debt to the band's San Francisco punk forefathers. The bass part for that, explains Klaus, there's a part where it goes into the chorus, and I do this 1515 thing, which I saw from the Avengers. The Avengers predated us. They were one of the bands I really liked watching. They were one of the bands that made me decide I wanted to get into a punk band. The bass player is Jimmy Wilsey, who ended up playing guitar for Chris Isaak. At the time, back in 77/78, he was playing this astoundingly aggressive bass. He had this one part that went really fast, and I thought, okay, I'm going to put that in this thing. Some of it, again, is real old influences. Some are influences that had come in the last year. You borrow, you steal. Amateurs borrow, professionals steal. Forward to Death, a brutal, nihilistic thrash, was written by the departed 6025, though on the finished album he only actually played on Ill in the Head, adding overdubs. 6025 wanted to do more avant-garde stuff, says Ray. He thought we were too mainstream and poppy. Although 6025 brought in Forward to Death, it really was a band effort. People have a hard time knowing how band dynamics work in a musical situation. That one he brought in, but that's straight-ahead punk rock. The chord pattern, it wouldn't matter who played that. But after the first verse, I do some little single-line things. Someone described it as a wall of sound with graffiti on it. So there are graffiti parts in there, if you listen. Those were probably just made up in practice, or maybe at a show. When you play for an audience, the song changes a bit. According to Ted, through rehearsals and jamming, we all figured out on our own what was the best. There were suggestions from other members of the band, why don't you try this or that, so it was a somewhat collaborative effort on most of the songs. But overall, every person was responsible for coming up with their own part, or how they would play. Ill in the Head was much more angular, according to Ray. We would try to make it more digestible for punk rock people, I guess. It still retains, however, several separate sections and time signatures, ostensibly moving from a 13/8 to 11/8 structure. Both traits are exceedingly uncommon in Western musical composition, though the Grateful Dead, Van der Graaf Generator, Caravan and other prog rock groups experimented with the latter, but more prominent in Turkish and Romani traditions. It would have had even more parts if we hadn't edited it, Ray laughs. One of the parts of the creative process is editing. What you take out can make what's left sound better. But then, as Klaus notes, all the songs, everyone has a little bit that they bring in. Ill in the Head was basically a 6025 song. But the thing that was purely his on that song was the ending, in terms of what the guitars are playing. My bass part, he didn't tell me what to play, but the idea of those 3 little sections at the end was 6025. It was a strange thing for us to learn, but he put it down. Then I came up with the idea of playing the 3 against the 4 on the bass. 6025 wanted us to play something like 11/8 at the end for part of it. There are things like that put in there totally to throw someone. The song had stemmed from Biafra handing Carlos a set of lyrics without music, the only time, he maintains, he did that in the band. I just handed it to Carlos and let him play around with the words and come up with some music from it. I largely stepped back from writing the music when he was in the band, because he seemed to be coming up with more surprises more quickly, and I lost confidence for a while. Chemical Warfare was the first song I brought in after he left the band. Years later, he showed me a completely different version of the words to Ill in the Head that he said I had handed him first. It turned out that the ones he had were better, but by then the album was out, so it was a little late. Carlos would subsequently work with Residence collaborator Snakefinger. He appears in the video to The Man in the Dark Sedans. Rumors abound about the DKS second guitarist's subsequent mental frailty. He is still, apparently, finishing his Christian punk rock opera. He had been deeply religious in high school, recalls Biafra, then chucked religion when he was in Dead Kennedys. Thus the Religious Vomit song he wrote, which the band would record for In God We Trust, Inc. Later he went back to religion and told me, at one point, he wanted to be the Captain Beefheart of gospel music. His last brush with notoriety came in April 1993 when he attended a show at the Gilman Street punk venue and was so outraged by the lewd acts performed by Marian Anderson of In Saints, involving lesbian dominatrix sessions, that he called the police. Coverage of the event made reference to fist-fucking and bananas, which may or may not have taken place, but Biafra believes 2 women kissing would have been enough for Carlos. It led to his former bandmates answering a slew of awkward questions about why a former Dead Kennedy would become an overnight prude and police informant. He left, confirms Ray, but they were good songs, and we'd been playing them, and added our own twist to them to keep them. In Ill in the Head, there's a 2-guitar harmony part, so we asked him to come in to play his part. After he left the band, I don't think we played that live anymore. It needs 2 interlocking guitar parts. Perhaps I could have got a double-neck guitar. Biafra's recall is different. Ill in the Head was in our repertoire all the way to the end, Drug Me Too. One statement to their musicianship is that we always knew all our songs, so our sets changed nightly. If I called out Drug Me on the spur of the moment, we could play it. The guitar part in between the verse-vocal lines of Ill in the Head is Carlos playing the part he wrote for Ray backwards. Carlos was very proud of that. He wanted to go in a more prog rock direction than the other guys in the band, Biafra continues. He even at one point asked me if I would take up flute, because that's what Ian Anderson played with Jethro Tull. He hadn't cut the cord with the excesses of 70s rock nearly as much as the rest of the band. I think he may have been the most brilliant musician we ever had in the band. He could play anything. He even got behind the drum set to show Bruce how he wanted him to play the ending in Ill in the Head, and he played it perfectly. He was a musical genius. Why can't Biafra say that about Klaus and me? Demands Ray, inadvertently coughing up one huge emotional fur ball. It would be nice if he said something nice about my unique guitar playing. I'm going to cry here. He's only half joking, too. Without getting into the grist of songwriting dues, Biafra, due to other factors, has always been circumspect about crediting the excellence of Ray and Klaus's musical contributions to Dead Kennedys. Ray is indisputably a great guitar player, with an incredibly varied palette and distinctive sound. Klaus, too, has a highly individual touch, his bass lines intractably harmonious, regardless of the brutality of the musical landscape, while his talent for arranging is a comparatively unacknowledged facet of Fresh Fruit. 10 in retaining 6,025 songwriting contributions to the band. It's important to note that the eventual track selection was deliberately time-sealed. By the time we made Fresh Fruit, says Biafra, I guess we had a feeling we might be around for a while. We didn't have to shoot our wad all on one album. We had Bleed for Me and maybe even Moon Over Marin by then, and then some of the songs that wound up on subsequent mini-album, In God We Trust, Inc. But I had a strong feeling that we shouldn't just drop the early, simpler punk songs and go into what turned into plastic surgery disasters to capture us right then in the moment. I thought it was important to document everything, step by step. Thus we didn't record Bleed for Me, but we did record songs like Your Emotions or Ill in the Head that we weren't really playing much anymore. I wound up choosing the final mixes and track order. I figured it out the same way I figure out track orders today, just cruise around in my car, listening to one until it works. Ray, unsurprisingly enough, disputes that Biafra chose the running order. There's a whole bunch of notes in my handwriting. What happened was we picked 4 orders and put them in a hat, and everybody voted on it, and Biafra counters, what a laugh. Can't they give me credit for one tiny thing? Fallout #4, March 1981, featuring a collage designed by Jade Scotty. Stealing People's Mail owed much to Biafra's abiding affection for 60s garage rock. That was the first rock and roll I ever heard. Even later, when I was blundering into Music Machine, 13th Floor Elevators and Seeds albums for next to nothing in second-hand shops, I realized how much I still liked that music, and how those songs were written and put together in a different way from Led Zeppelin songs. Another inspiration for Stealing People's Mail was the Screamers, too. That was kind of the structure of it. It could be played on a distorted keyboard as well. We even brought Paul Roessler from the Screamers up to play on the studio version of that song, and he wound up doing the solo instead of Ray, who played something completely different live. Roessler would also provide keyboard accompaniment to Drug Me alongside Ninotchka. In terms of pushing the envelope, the frantic Drug Me predicted the lightspeed thrash Dead Kennedys would explore through In God We Trust, Inc., which in turn became a staging post for the coming hardcore generation. Drug Me seemed almost a manifesto statement, as if they were pushing themselves musically as far as they possibly could. I don't know what we were thinking, admits Ray. Nowadays, with Pro Tools, we could make everything lock up perfectly. But we were just playing it. Now that you mention it, let's see how fast we can play this and make it still hang together but still rock out. I guess there was a little bit of that. It became something of a rod for their own backs, however. It was impossible to play that song live, notes Klaus. I've got videos of us doing it live. We did it amazingly enough, but I'm sure that was the one we had to record most times in the studio to get it right. Sure, we were trying to push as hard as we could. Stealing People's Mail was rippingly fast as well, whereas Let's Lynch the Landlord is pretty straight ahead. If anyone wants to do their study, they can find the roots of that riff real easy. We're thinking the Blues Magoo's Old Nuggets classic, We Ain't Got Nothing Yet. The lyric to Drug Me bounces between the fantastical and the utterly mundane, from fuck machines to crossword puzzles. Part of what I was getting at was not just chemical additions, Biafra says, but what David Thomas of Pure Ubu called psychobulk in his interview with Search and Destroy. That's where you have television or some other thing to go in and out of your head, but not be remembered, as kind of a soothing narcotic. That's the crossword puzzles, and thus trends and fads and rock and roll. I didn't put TV in the lyric because that's such an obvious example. Its sheer velocity, the evolution was conceptual as well as musical. Sometimes I have this problem, notes Biafra, where I visualize or hear a song or a riff in my head, and usually it will be a lot slower than how I think it ought to sound with an actual band. So that one didn't just seem to click when it was slower, and it was supposed to be one of those manic, screamers-type songs. Even if I started out trying to do one type of song, it would often come out sounding completely different. I might think screamers on the verse, and then something completely different on the chorus. I might think screamers vibe on the verse, 'cause it's not like I was taking their riffs or anything. Viva Las Vegas, meanwhile, was a perfect choice for album closer. Viva Las Vegas began a Dead Kennedys tradition that I've carried on to this day of picking very unlikely cover tunes. Continues Biafra, something that will send a shock wave through the crowd. What the hell are they playing that for? We never covered I Wanna Be Your Dog or Folsom Prison Blues, though Biafra did record backing vocals to the Red Rockers studio version. And we didn't follow all the 70s bar bands and cover Chuck Berry's songs to the point where it would ruin Chuck Berry for life for a lot of people. It was Ted who suggested covering Viva Las Vegas. Being mostly unfamiliar with Elvis at the time, I'd never heard the song and I'd never even heard of the movie. And once I heard it, I thought, yes, that would be pretty funny. Let's do it. Biafra reveled in the role of hyperventilating punk crooner, as if to the manner born. It wasn't the way I did it live. When I tried it that way in the studio, it was so funny I kept it. I also tried Kill the Poor in a Brian Ferry voice as a gag, but we ended up not using it. Back then I really had trouble hitting the high note at the beginning. Then I thought I should try Undertones vocalist Feargal Sharkey. Then I hit it. But we learned songs slowly. They usually took a while to gel. It meant that we didn't learn a lot of other covers, just for the sake of being able to rotate them in the set. We tried that early on by adding the Who's Boris the Spider, but our version wasn't particularly interesting. Carlos said afterwards that he thought it was pointless trying to keep up with a new song for every single show, even if it was a cover, and not coming up with good songs. And he had a point. The whole album sounded unlike anything that had preceded it. There were enough elements that were demonstrably punk to locate it within that genre, but otherwise it looked, sounded, and felt different. I would say this is probably the responsibility, or mostly had to do with Biafra, suggests Ted, not compromising the music and not turning into a reggae band or having that more Clash-type pop influence, but sticking to his guns. It's one thing I respect about the guy. This is the band, and this is the sound, and we're not going to be something. We're not just to be more commercial. The thing about Fresh Fruit, notes Ray, is that it had the variety of songs. There were the hardcore songs like Drug Me, the neo-psychedelic songs like Holiday in Cambodia, the more art songs like Ill in the Head, and pop songs like Kill the Poor. We all liked different types of music. All music doesn't have to be political. And all punk music doesn't have to be political. And it doesn't have to be serious. That's one of the joys of Dead Kennedys. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheek stuff. We really weren't advocating killing the poor. That was satire. Klaus concurs. There was serious stuff going on where we used humor. It goes back to the Lenny Bruce thing. You use humor to point out the disaster that's going on around you, otherwise you can't take it. We were inspired by people like The Residents and DeVoe, and Zappa, for taking music and making it make fart noises, basically. Aside from 6025 Forward to Death and Raise Your Emotions, the lyrics were overwhelmingly Biafra's. One of the influences I had on Biafra and his lyrics was to try to make them more timeless, says Ray, in one of his more implausible claims. I suggested some lyric changes, because my thing is, you've got to change it from journalism to poetry. Like at the beginning of I Kill Children, the original lyrics are, "The Ayatollah told me to skin you alive." I suggested he change it to "God told me to skin you alive." 'Cause how many people remember Ayatollah Khomeini? Biafra snarls at the suggestion. Change my lyrics. They never once did anything of the kind. They never read them, much to my heartbreak. The Khomeini reference was not the original. The original was always "God told me to skin you alive." I got it out of one of those little religious comic books by Chick Publications, the corny uber-right wing religious publisher, whose output also inspired Alice Donut's Disturbing Lisa's father. That's where I got it from. 11. Ian McNay flew out to California to meet the band and hear the album. I hadn't spoken to the band directly, but it was arranged through a guy called Craig Hammond, whom I'd met in London. Craig was a part-time DJ with a huge record collection. He provided a small service where he would get your records out to good radio stations and DJs in America who would play our sort of records. He knew the band, so he was kind of a contact person. When I went over, he picked me up from the airport and drove around to the flat where I met them. They had pretty much the finished album. It wasn't mixed, but it was all recorded. I asked to hear it. They were having a bit of a party at the time. I remember sitting in the kitchen on my own with the kitchen door closed, listening to it on a cheap portable tape recorder. that was the only thing I could listen to it on. In a way, that was quite a good thing. It's always much better to hear something on the medium that most people will hear it rather than a super expensive system in the studio. They were making a noise in the next room, and I was straining to hear this album I'd spent $10,000 on to see what it was like. I immediately liked the album. I spent a bit of time with the band and with Biafra. I went back to London and the master tapes from the album followed fairly shortly afterwards, and the artwork and everything else. Said artwork, Biafra's concept, featured a Judith Colson still from the San Francisco Examiner, picturing a row of burning police cars. It was taken in 1979, in the wake of the White Night riots, after a verdict of voluntary manslaughter was returned against former police officer Dan White, who had shot gay rights campaigner Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone, and escaped with a 3 to 5 year sentence. White's lawyers claimed he had eaten too many Twinkie cakes on the day before the killing, and the consequent sugar rush unbalanced him. The Twinkie defense, a term coined by satirist Paul Krasner, has since become acknowledged shorthand for a spurious or improbable legal defense. Biafra would return to the subject in the rewritten lyrics to the band's cover of I Fought the Law, amending the lyric to I Fought the Law, and I won, and finally I am the law, so I won. Another of his mayoral policy strands was for the installation of concessions in public spaces to allow citizens to throw rotten fruit at specially erected statues of White, perhaps the most hated man in San Franciscan history, according to the San Francisco Weekly. However, the sleeve reproduction lost some of the clarity of the image, the grainy monochrome finish meaning that, to this uninitiated purchaser at least, it resembled a traffic jam wreathed in its own smog rather than a riot scene. When the record was released domestically by IRS, they thoughtfully added an orange tint to the flames to distinguish them. It wasn't just the flames, notes Biafra, it was the whole photo. Orange and white with black DK lettering. Totally ruined it. Biafra insisted they change it back and denounced it thus at a 1981 show at Washington's 930 Club. Some of you stooped so low as to buy our wonderful album, even with the shitty Disneyland orange cover, which was not our idea. The rear cover artwork proved even more problematic. After release, the album was subject to a lawsuit from the Sounds of Sunshine, who had enjoyed a minor hit with a cheesy version of Love Means Never Having to Say You're Sorry. They'd been pictured in wholesome fashion in a 1971 photo, although the uninitiated would have supposed it to be much older than that. They didn't take kindly to either the DK symbol or the skull and crossbones superimposed on their instruments. The back cover came from a glossy photo that Klaus used to have nailed to his bedroom door that he had found at a garage sale, Biafra explains. There was no photographer or band credit on it anywhere. It came to their attention when a sports writer, of all people, reviewed fresh fruit in a suburban LA daily newspaper, and the paper ran the photo saying it was us. Then they came out of the woodwork and sued us. It turned out most of the people involved in the band were now hardcore, right-wing Christians. The song they particularly objected to was I Kill Children, especially the first few lines, which they quoted in their press release. Ever since then, from crazy preachers on TV to Tipper Gore's anti-music crusade, it's those lines of I Kill Children that are quoted in order to condemn dead Kennedys. I don't think anyone from Tipper Gore on down knew what the rest of the song lyrics were. In other words, the religious right backlash started with the people on the back of the album cover. The woman, in particular, objected to that photo because she didn't want her current gospel music fans to know she had ever had a beehive hairdo. Ironically, IRS Records paid out a settlement to them, possibly more than they ever paid the band. Subsequent copies saw Cherry Red remove the heads of each figure, though this decorative decapitation was done without authorization from the band. 12. The album came with a lavish collage poster of bizarre press cuttings collated and curated over several years by Biafra. I did it in 36 hours straight. Among other things, I was listening to Joy Division's Closer album for the first and only time, after I'd got it earlier that day. I was listening to it as the sun came up, and I realized how late it was. The poster still wasn't done. McNay's deadline was fast approaching, and the clock was ticking. A lot of the images I'd had up on my bedroom wall as a teenager in Colorado for years, and people used to like to come over and look at it. And without putting it into words, just crisscrossing all those surreal images in their minds made people think. I wanted to do some special art after seeing the fold-out artwork that Crass was coming up with. I thought, wow, imagine if Crass was funny. All I have to do is condense my bedroom walls into a collage poster, and there it will be. No explanation, but you'll look at it again and again. Winston Smith came by the house after the first 30 hours and added a few things himself. But most of it was me. I couldn't find any poster paper, so I got promo posters from stores. That's the reason that Travolta and Olivia Newton-John from the Grease cover are defaced on one side of the poster. All I had to paste the pictures on was a promo poster for the Grease soundtrack album. Winston Smith, a self-confessed graphic wisecracker, had been introduced to Biafra through a mutual friend who helped with the artwork on a magazine produced by the San Francisco chapter of Rock Against Racism. Biafra already knew of his work, in particular a three-dimensional image of a cross constructed out of dollar bills, entitled Idol. It would later be used as the artwork for Dead Kennedy's mini-LP, In God We Trust, Inc. Smith sent over a postcard with a still of JFK's brain exploding, taken from the Abraham Zapruder film sequence. On the back of subsequent correspondence, which included exchanging samples of Smith's collage work and fake Masterscam credit cards, they would become firm friends, or perhaps partners in crime. Smith remembers spending several nights well into the wee hours working together on the double-sided composition that became the album's central insert feature. That was truly a labor of love. Not quite sure where the original is anymore. Probably stashed in Biafra's closet next to the jar with Hitler's brain in it. Smith was also responsible for the DK's logo, subsequently among the most reproduced and recognizable insignia of the worldwide punk movement, on the label and rear sleeve. One crucial near derailment was still to be averted, however, as Biafra recollects. Ian was so desperate to get the album out ahead of all the other full releases, a smart move, more press coverage. He skipped so much as sending us a test pressing. Then the album came out, and we discovered to our horror that not only had the mastering engineer, Kevin Metcalf, calibrated his machine wrong so all the bass and bottom end was gone, but he had run the tape too fast. Talk about careless. This means that those who bought the album first, and presumably those reviewing it, were rewarded with a cartoon fresh fruit on helium. One of the first things we did when we got to England was to properly remaster the album with another engineer straight away, along with The Kill, the poor /Insight single. The lack of care on this was another contributing factor to our departure from Cherry Red. The critical reaction to the album was underwhelming. John Tobler at Zig Zag was a fan, but UK Inkai's proved more prickly. Andy Gill at NME, while admiring Fresh Fruit's grasp of dynamics and highly ordered arrangements, ultimately dismissed it for hitting targets well wide of the mark, if indeed the arrows are anything more than little barbs of punky vaudeville. In America, both Robert Christgau and Lester Bangs were equally sniffy, the former being particularly withering, especially about Biafra's Tiny Tim vibrato. Dead Kennedy's hard rock comic, Oh, originally published by Revolutionary Comics. Words by Dina Dassine, artwork by Joe Paradise, stuff by J. Allen Sanford. Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, UK first pressing and edited rear cover photograph from second pressing following lawsuit 1980. Cherry Red, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables labels Australian, Brazilian, US, Polish, German, and Greek. 1980-81, Let Them Eat Jellybeans compilation album 1981, Alternative Tentacles, I. MG alt equals image, SRC equals images /131, JPG/. Chapter 7. Don't forget to pack a wife. The first condition of understanding a foreign country is to smell it. Rudyard Kipling, D.E.'d Kennedys would build on their reputation in Europe with 3 tours in 2 years, the first supported by UK Decay, which proved an eye-opener for all involved. Biafra would do almost anything to get a reaction, recalls Bill Gilliam. He notably introduced to the UK the art of stage diving as a participatory sport. One of the reasons to jump into crowds is because then you're no longer a performer talking down at the audience, Biafra states. You're one and the same. It may be a dubious legacy, but it started out well-intentioned. As Gilliam remembers, no one had ever done that in this country. It was really the start of something. Kids loved it, the stage diving. The first tour, one of the main problems was restraining the security. At every gig they'd see the audience going crazy, thought that the place was going to get smashed up, and it was a job to keep them calm. The band was generally impressed by the intelligence of the audiences, and bouncers aside, relished the lack of testosterone-fueled violence that was creeping into the American punk scene. On the back of the album, Dead Kennedys started their mini-tour with a show at the Taboo in Scarborough on 25 September 1980, after a proposed gig at Middlesbrough Rock Garden was switched. The hero worship got a little out of hand, with Klaus having his glasses stolen as a trinket. They were returned at the door as the Klepto Klaus fan made his exit. Steve Harland was one of the Barrow boys who made the trip. My memories of the gig are they were so loud, probably the loudest band, bar Slade, I had ever witnessed live. As they went off, some wag in the crowd stole Klaus's glasses, so a request went out if we wanted the DKs to do an encore. The bass player wanted his glasses back first, or they wouldn't be coming back on. We had to wait 15 minutes before his glasses were returned and the DKs came back, but by then the impetus from the gig had evaporated. Rich Teal was also in the audience. The place was jam-packed, with the crowd going mad. The bouncers at Taboo were well known for being heavy-handed, and quite a few people were thrown out, although there was no violence. It was at the end of the set that someone nicked Klaus's glasses, so the band refused to do an encore until he got them back, which he did, so there was a delay of a few minutes. Too Drunk to Fuck was played and was introduced as a new song. The band had nowhere to stay that night and stopped at Gary Bennett's, a mate of mine's. A subsequent date in Dundee was cancelled by the local council on the premise that their presence might alienate residents of Alexandria, the American city they were twinned with. As a result, all 4 members of Dead Kennedys were banned for life. It wasn't just city elders who found the band's presence on our shores irksome, however. Sounds critic Dave McCullough paid them the following backhanded compliment. Dead Kennedys coming to Europe and England is the silliest, most wretchedly useless conceit I've heard all year. Why aren't they pushing fresh fruit in America, where it's urgently needed, instead of peddling it second-hand in England? Ray recalls the sniffy critical reception in the UK. The Sex Pistols and The Clash were English, and I think there was at that time the tendency in Europe to think you had all the good bands, and there wasn't much coming out of America. In America, punk rock was not part of the mainstream record business. It was really independent, and it made it even harder to get stuff, while The Clash and Sex Pistols were on major labels and got worldwide distribution. Further dates, including one on 8 October at the Lyceum, were also pulled, with a switch to London's Music Machine instead. The cancellations were intractably linked to the band's name, Biafra telling the NME that it's designed not only to torpedo an annoying form of religion that sprung up around the Kennedys, but also to get under people's skin and annoy them, and thereby opening ways of using it as bait. Once they found out that far, then they're going to find out about more things that we want them to know about that they don't want to hear about but should. Mick McGee saw it all firsthand. I was 17 in 1980, making me 14 in 76, living in the north with my own band Mayhem. We were having our own thing in Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and Sheffield. To me, Fresh Fruit was an injection of new blood. Bands, lyrics, outlooks from America in the punk's not dead but dying era of the next wave of 80s punk. I heard Uber Alles and was mesmerized totally, off the scale at its time. The tour was announced after the release of Cambodia. By now, these clandestine bastards were pounding out of every orifice of punk venues in England. McGee made every DK's gig on that first tour, and every subsequent show too. The first date was the Taboo in Scarborough. I had no cash, so decided to hitch. Keeping in mind the Yorkshire Ripper was on the loose, and terrorizing a vast area that the tour was passing through, getting a lift wasn't easy, and we found the more stupidly we behaved handstand cartwheels, notwithstanding the better the chance of a lift. We arrived at Scarborough via an open-top silage truck. The venue looked from the outside like a tattoo shop, pink Dayglow frontage in a side street. This was the first and last time I put $1 in the DKS pocket. We ended up upstairs playing the pinball machines. An American guy was hanging around and we got talking, and sussed he was connected to the band. He gave me a pass to the next gig in Edinburgh. At this time, Brit punks were into the leather studs, and bristles look the DKs were not. This was the first time most of the audience had seen Jello and the Boys, and it was not what they'd expected. They generally looked like some guys off the street, and could well have been the potential victims of said leather-clad mad dogs. All these preconceptions went out the window with the opening chord. It was blistering. The guy who had given me the pass was now bare-chested and utterly consumed in fronting his band. Klaus was almost dwarfed by the massive green bass strapped round his neck emblazoned with the Danish DK bumper sticker. Ray looked almost goth-like, pale-skinned and jet-black hair. Ted was Mr. Average, nailing his kit. Edinburgh was a long way to hitch, but I was going. The gig was at a venue with 2 performance spaces, and Gary Newman was playing. This was a recipe for destruction, with 2 long queues of hardcore punks and electro heads meeting head-on at the door. Great gig, and off to Liverpool. By this time I had realized that the whole tour shot up and down England, and I don't mean progressively working up then down. It literally went north then south then north again. My thumb was getting RSI at some point. The Liverpool Brady's show, formerly Eric's, on 29 September took place after the defeat of Alan Minter by Marvin Hagler in a middleweight championship bout at Wembley 2 days previously, which ended in a riot with racist overtones. In a show of sympathy, the audience sieg-heiled the visiting imperialist American punks. Knowing the Eric's crowd, you would think they were more than likely taking the piss. Majee concurs. Brady's was in the basement of an old city warehouse across the road from the original cavern. He notes, it was a punk bastion frequented by all types of hardcore believers, one of whom was a guy called Gary, or Gary Fast Dance as we named him. Gary had one individual style of dance, and it wasn't fast. In fact, he swayed slowly in his ankle-length Mac at exactly the same speed to every thrash track that was played, and Uber Alles was a favorite. Gary incorporated a Nazi salute at the chorus with no other intention than to emphasize the irony of the lyrics, and this caught on. Soon the whole club was mimicking it. I got to the gig early, Majee continues, and chatted to Grizzly, who worked for the PA crew Scan. The crew had by now seen me hanging around before the gigs, and I gave them a hand getting the gear in and out. Grizz wasn't too happy as someone had thrown up all over the mixing desk the night before, and they had spent a good part of the night cleaning it. He wasn't in the mood for any grief from the boisterous Liverpool lads queuing outside. Brady's was small and bloody hot. UK Decay warmed up the crowd and did well despite the drummer having somehow broken his hand and being in plaster on stage. When the Kennedys came on, the place took off. They had been waiting a long time for this gig, and John Peel had been raving about and playing tracks from Rotting Vegetables. As usual, the crowd were taking the piss in between songs. All good stuff. I know I played Eric's/Brady's many times with my band Mayhem, and knew that if you couldn't deal with Scouse wit, or if they could find any chink in your armor and you went on the back foot, they would rip the living shit out of you. Klaus bass rumbled into California, backed by Ted's toms, pounding out that familiar beat. The crowd erupted. Then it was like an accident about to happen that you can't stop. As the DKs reached the chorus, the whole crowd in complete unison gave the Nazi salute. As far as the eye could see, there were outstretched arms. The Kennedy Express jumped the tracks, and a momentary silence followed. "What are you doing? That's not what this is about, we ain't Nazis," bellowed Biafra. He went on to berate the crowd for a good 5 minutes. I felt I should have told Biafra that they were far from racist. Liverpool is fully aware of its history in the slave trade and had a good multicultural mix. It wasn't meant with any malice, but a comment later about a boxer left Liverpool and Biafra with a bad taste in their mouths. I spoke to Biafra after the show, and I said I would give him the heads up on anything I thought he should know about the rest of the gigs. My contact with the band had been limited to pre- and post-gig high and buys, but now I was of some use to them. Tickets for the show at the Lead Mill in Sheffield on 3 October were doctored to Dead Kennedys as a compromise with the city council. It turned out to be quite an evening. Crazy, notes our generation author Tony Beasley. Jello threatened to bang out any more gobbing punks and they stopped, but the beer was still getting thrown constantly. Jello dived into the audience, and it was mental. The place appeared to be falling down at the time. There was no roof in places. One of the people who didn't see the DKs at the Sheffield Lead Mill was Damon Fairclough. Flailing, venomous, they came screaming by, and in those brief moments of noise and dread, the Dead Kennedys were ciphers for things that I never suspected. A president had his head demolished in order that they should be so named. The West Coast scene from which they sprang was fired by a muscle-bound political viciousness that was focused and motivated. The language they used wasn't subtly ironic, it was sarcasm wielded as brutally as a nightstick. "I kill children indeed." These things were all but lost on me, but to my dad, always interested in the music I professed to like, and intrigued by punk as a social phenomenon, or as a new folk music, here was cause for alarm. This was not like the Damned, who were feathered and bowed with the spirit of the music hall, and who were just a mouthful of gob away from being suitable guests on the good old days. And despite You Dirty Fucker and the rest of that Bill Grundy pantomime, even the Sex Pistols turned out to be more art school prank than sedition made flesh. Nothing wrong with art school pranks, of course, but they don't chill the parental blood quite like the DKs hollering "This world brings me Dowwooin. I'm looking forward to death." When I played the Dead Kennedys, I heard a sound that was scabrous and incandescent, that scorched the Teak Effect Music Center from whence it came. So when I brought home the Dead Kennedys' album Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, there was much furrowing of brows and hovering in doorways. There was earnest stroking of chins. There were sudden and serious conversations that seemed to come out of nowhere about songs that said one thing and meant something else, about discussion and argument, about nihilism and protest, about Jello Biafra's visions of Amory KKKA. I believe there were whispered discussions when I'd gone to bed, undertakings to keep an eye on this, and to be watchful, wary of some threat left unspecified, but that could tip me into future oblivion. In the autumn of 1980, a school friend of mine returned from the summer break, somewhat translated. His hair was cropped spikily short, his natural blonde locks were streaked vivid orange. This fresh-faced junior punk would bring back reports from his family home, though to us they may as well have been coming from another universe. His parents owned never mind the bollocks. His sister had dyed her pubes green, and then came the news that, aged 13, he was going to a gig at the Sheffield lead mill. He was going to see the Dead Kennedys. He was going with his fucking mum and dad. They weren't there to chaperone him, or monitor his activities, or warn him of the dangerous paths that might lie ahead. No, they were there to see the band. That's all. To see the band and spend some time with their son, which went to prove little except that, in the words of teenagers everywhere, life was so unfair. Dead Kennedys UK Tour, Liverpool Brady's, 29 September 1980. Photography by Mick McGee. Mick McGee continued to hitchhike the rest of the tour. The PA crew took me under their wings, and I did the get-ins and outs, but was still hitching and sleeping rough, and it was heading into winter. I was now working with Scan as a free box pusher, heavy work. Scan took pity on me and allowed me to sleep in the cab of the hire truck. Sadly, this did not last long due to my smelly feet, so I slept in the back with the gear. The truck became the only thing I was interested in while traveling. It was a joy and reassuring to search the cities and towns and spot the Dayglow pink and yellow paint job Edwin Shirley still used today. It meant I had made it to the gig. If Biafra was in the mood, McGee continues, he would soak himself and the audience with water, lots of it from pint glasses. It was everywhere, including all over our sleeping bags. On realizing this mid-gig, I dragged the sodden rags back to the dressing room and draped them over the radiators, trying not to soak a grand piano that was in there for some unknown reason. Some time later, I headed back to the sweltering dressing room. The door was open, and I encountered the most bizarre sound of Cambodia being played on the piano, which was set up there. I also noted the smell. To quote the man, "It smells like Dakar." On entering, I saw it was Ted playing the piano, who on seeing me launched with the rest of the band into a rousing chorus of "Right Guard Will Not Help You Here." They were fucking right, it stank. The final gig was at, of all places, West Runton Pavilion in Cromer. The bouncers were a local rugby team cum wannabe bikers, recalls McGee. I recall one of them saying he couldn't wait to get his hands on one of the spiky fuckers, as he set up a scoreboard for him and his mates to see how many punks they could squish. At 11 a.m., it looked like a quiet rural village, but by 6:30 p.m. it was madness. Coachload after coachload of stoned, drunk punks shipped in from neighboring towns and fell out of the doors. One of the drivers collapsed from passive glue inhalation. The bouncers got out of control, and me and Micro overruled them, but not before Dick Forbrains claimed his first point, a vomiting young kid who could hardly stand up. Meanwhile, Biafra introduced the as then largely unheard Too Drunk to Fuck Thus. One of these days this song will come out as a single, if we're allowed to make any more records. It's our universal pop song we figure everyone can relate to. The remixed Kill the Poor was concurrently released as the third single from the album. McNay devised a promotional campaign using a photograph of the Conservative Party conference, with the party banner airbrushed out to read "Kill the Poor" instead. I thought if the magazines and newspapers see the advert in advance, McNay recalls, they won't let me run it. So I found out what their deadlines were and delivered it a few minutes before, so it would be hard to pull it. We got it in all the magazines and weeklies. We did get taken to an advertising complaints tribunal, but all they said was, "Don't run that advert again," which of course we had no intention of doing. Originally, McNay had been keen to see Viva Las Vegas released as the third single. I thought we could get daytime Radio 1 on that. Obviously Peel had played Cambodia, and I think Mike Reed played Cambodia as well. I thought it wouldn't be too difficult to extend it. We wouldn't have got the breakfast show, but we would have got late afternoon shows for Viva Las Vegas. I was very keen on this and even scheduled it. Then Biafra said no, he didn't want to release it. I said fair enough, but we'd got partly down the line on that and even organized a plugger to work on it. I thought we could have had a top 40 hit with that track and broken the band to a whole different audience, but it wasn't to be. McNay would get his hit in 1981 when the band's Too Drunk to Fuck, a song that always owed something to the Alley Cats, Nothing Means Nothing Anymore, became the first record with the titular expletive to break the top 40. Biafra wasn't at all keen on either the release of Kill the Poor or Viva Las Vegas. Kill the Poor was just yanked off the album and a different mix thrown on the single, Biafra affirms, to derail Ian McNay's scheme to release Viva Las Vegas as a novelty single, confine us to that, and move on to another project. We said no, it's going to be Kill the Poor, and you're not putting Inside Out as a flexidisc. We're yanking Viva Las Vegas and putting it on as the B-side, whether you like it or not. Ray claims it was a group decision. This happened a lot. The band would discuss something, and then Biafra would call Ian and say we don't want to do it. Then Ian assumes Biafra's doing it. Dead Kennedys UK Tour, Liverpool Brady's, 29 September 1980. Photography by Mick McGee. According to Ray, the same thing happened with the media. Biafra was the frontman and spokesman, and he loved doing interviews. And people presumed because he said it, it was his idea. That's a wrong presumption. A lot of the political ideas were mine, in terms of real solutions to problems. In terms of putting things in a nice slogan, Biafra was brilliant at that. I see things as more complex. All of us, we definitely had discussions. But there are plenty of ideas I see in interviews that people don't attribute to Klaus or me that were probably our ideas originally. That's the way journalists work. But once people talk to me, they realize, hey, he does know what the Federal Reserve does. 13 all of which really pisses me off, states Biafra. What a lie. These guys were fucking allergic to interviews. They'd run off and party every night and leave me in the dressing room to do all the interviews, even though my throat was shot. This became such a sore point with me that it nearly helped break up the band in '84. The album performed better than anyone could have envisaged. By 1980, around 30,000 copies had been sold in the UK, and it went top 10 in Finland, Spain, Portugal, and Australia. It was the first classic American punk album of the post-CBGB generation, if we are to lay aside the Germs' storied but patchy GI from 1979, with Black Flag's Damaged still a year away. Our story closes in December 1980, when Ted announced his departure, ostensibly to further his architectural studies, though he continued in the Wolverines, with whom he had been playing intermittently, and who additionally briefly featured Klaus in their ranks. He played his final set with Dead Kennedys that month, before being replaced by D.H. Peligro, whom Biafra had spotted playing with SSI at the Def Club, and was subsequently invited to audition after bumping into Ray at the Mabuhay. Klaus and Ray are on record as saying Ted's departure resulted from a me or him ultimatum issued by Biafra, but the real reasons were prosaic. We asked him to leave, confirms Biafra. The reason was musical differences, that old cliché, and the decision was unanimous. The first order of business in 1981 was finding a new drummer, and Peligro debuted that February. The band also cut the cord with Cherry Red following the June 1981 release of Too Drunk to Fuck. They had been angered by the label's penchant for intensive farming its back catalog and McNay's reluctance that Cherry Red become too synonymous with either punk or Dead Kennedys. We were never on truly bad terms, recalls Biafra. We just left the label because they were overly exploitative of the catalog, changing the sleeve and redoing a 12-inch of Holiday in Cambodia and Too Drunk to Fuck to resell the same record, etc. Plus, in a crucial move, they declined to release Let Them Eat Jelly Beans, because they didn't want to be too closely associated with Dead Kennedys. The latter was a compilation album through which Biafra intended to highlight the frustrated talents of bands denied the chance Dead Kennedys had enjoyed, including Black Flag, Bad Brains, Doa, The Subhumans, and in a dues-paying thank you for giving the DKs a start in the first place, the Offs. Ultimately, many of these bands would be well-serviced by the revived alternative Tentacles, which Biafra resurrected after splitting from Cherry Red in the UK, and Faulty Products and Static in the US, neither of whom, advances aside, ever paid the band a penny. The first chapter of the Dead Kennedys story was complete. At least 2 further great albums, as well as lawsuits, police busts, censorship charges, literally riotous gigs, Penis Landscape, Tipper Gore, and the Oprah Winfrey Show lay ahead. Some other poor bastard can tackle that, though. Kill the Poor / Insight UK release 1980, Cherry Red. Kill the Poor / Viva Las Vegas Spanish promo plus first pressing 1981, Edigsa. P-Class equals. Page Kill the Poor / California Uber, Ales German release 1980. Hafenklang Spanish promo information sheet 1981. Edigsa, P-Class equals Pa. G Fallout #4, March 1981, by Winston Smith, featuring an advert for the single Too Drunk to Fuck. This was the original cover art, but Biafra later switched it for another image found in a religious tract. Smith later reused the original artwork for a compilation tribute CD of Japanese bands covering Dead Kennedys songs entitled Get Drunk More Fuck, released in 2010. All you ever do is complain, yeah. I don't like nostalgia. Unless it's mine. Lou Reed 30 Years On, Fresh Fruit, the most musically complex punk record ever released, as Mojo magazine once stated, and arguably the most funny, biting, and cerebral, has had colossal influence. Husker Du, Dinosaur Jr., the Pixies, Nirvana, and more recently everyone from Green Day and The Offspring to Massive Attack, The Prodigy and Franz Ferdinand, have absorbed and acknowledged its influence. Biafra, who remains a dyed-in-the-bones fan of the broader punk canon, finds the praise misplaced. You know enough about this music, as much as I do, that anyone who heard From the Cradle to the Grave by the Subhumans, or Zen Arcade by Husker Du, or Mission of Burma, or whatever, would just hotly dispute that. He's pushing at a locked door. Ted is also stoical when it comes to the warm afterglow of critical adulation for Fresh Fruit, and is not convinced that its pioneer status is deserved. I wouldn't say so, not from my point of view. It was rock and roll. I guess it was different than some other types of punk bands at the time, because there was Ray's surf-sounding guitar, and I didn't play the typical 2/4 hard-charging punk drum beats. It was more fluid, I would say, and Klaus's bass was somewhat more melodic than a lot of other bass players at the time. But in terms of it being avant-garde or reaching new boundaries, I don't know if I really felt that. He's also the most reserved about its achievements. To me, it lacks a little depth and punch and is flat-sounding. Some of it has to do with the way it was pressed from the master copy. Some of it also has to do with the way it was actually produced. Some of the albums that I think it could have been closer to and captured some of the depth and the punch in the bottom would be something like the Nirvana album, Nevermind. But the overall sound of the album, even today, I think it could be a different album and have even more of an impact if it was better produced. But then, Dead Kennedys had $10,000 to work with. Nirvana had somewhat more. And it's also worth pointing out that all three members of the latter band acknowledged the influence of Dead Kennedys at the time and since. It set the bar for us, says Klaus. The record sounded different to anything else at the time, which was what we were aiming for. We weren't aiming to sound better necessarily, just different. To have our own signature sound, and that album established that. We weren't a template for other bands to follow necessarily, as much as a template for ourselves to follow on from that Fresh Fruit album. There were a ton of bands that sounded like the Sex Pistols, and a ton of bands that sounded like the Ramones. There weren't a whole lot of bands that tried to sound like the Kennedys, but he enjoys the residual affection among both fans and musicians. It's hard to take in, sometimes, that people in these bands that I admire already have my stuff. It's a good feeling, Ted agrees. I'm still amazed. I have kids of my own, and their friends are more interested in the fact that I was in the band than my own children. Anytime you hear that, or people my own age who say, I used to go see you guys, it's great to hear. 50 years from now, says Ray, when we've all passed away, the only thing that's really going to matter is the music and the playing of the record. All the other stuff is a sideshow. What's interesting is that Fresh Fruit is closer to the start of rock and roll, like the Sun Sessions and Elvis Presley, than it is to today. It's kind of astonishing how much variety there was in the music between 1955 and 1980. Biafra is in the invidious position of emphasizing his belief in what the band achieved while distancing itself from the actions of the reformed group. To make it clear, I'm very proud of the music, the band, and what we accomplished when we were together. I've tried to maintain that spirit and that set of ethics since that time. Although it's the best known and most popular album they released, it still isn't Biafra's favorite. I like Plastic Surgery Disasters and Frankenchrist more because they're darker, more intricate. They had more musical contributions from other members of the band, believe it or not, and that was one of the reasons. More Holiday in Cambodia-like contributions from other members of the band. It was darker, more unique, more us. Fresh Fruit did, however, provide him with the sublime satisfaction of getting a roasting from his old adversary, Jared Johnson of the Denver Post. I got a clipping mailed to me, buyer for recalls. Instead of capsule reviews, Jared Johnson had devoted his entire column to how disgusted he was with fresh fruit for rotting vegetables. I've never felt such a sense of gratification and achievement in my life. That's exactly the impact I wanted it to have. 14 Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey Australian release 1981, missing link. Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey US release 1981, faulty products, P-class. Image caption Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey labels Canadian, Finnish, UK and US releases. 1981, Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey Irish clear vinyl release 1981. Cherry Red, Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey UK release 1981. Cherry Red, P-class image cap. Ion Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey label UK 12, release 1981. Cherry Red, Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey label New Zealand 12, release 1981. Cherry Red, Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey Greek release 1981. Music Box, Too Drunk T. Oh Fuck / The Prey Australian 12, release 1981. Cherry Red, Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey Greek release 1981. Music Box, Too Drunk to Fuck / The Prey Australian 12, release 1981. Cherry Red, rear cover img alt = image, src = images /16. 3 jpg /